Chapter 1329, Breakthrough. From such an incredibly high position, Meng Hao could now look down and see the outsiders. There were 3-5 essences experts among them, surrounded by hosts of other outsiders. Furthermore, they were not milling about chaotically, but rather had gathered in 3 specific areas. By chance, those 3 areas happened to be locations on the head of the god, where the stars existed. Meng Hao spotted Yuan Jian in another part of the Vale of the Godgrave, trudging along toward a lightning-filled area, where something like a corpse could be seen. That corpse was profoundly ancient, and if one looked closely enough, one would see that it was actually the finger of a god. Perhaps that was the location of Yuan Jian's good fortune. Meng Hao looked away from all of that for a moment. Everything he had seen in this dimension left him profoundly shaken. This world, this Vale of the Godgrave, was actually a head, the head of a god. Despite only being the head, Meng Hao could tell that it was even larger than the corpse he had encountered back in the ruins of immortality in the 9th mountain and sea. That in and of itself left Meng Hao deeply shaken. This is one of the outsider gods. His eyes shone with a strange light as he looked down at the enormous landmass which was formed by the head. All of a sudden, he saw images in his mind, a vision of these so-called gods, seemingly as tall as the heavens, whose enormous bodies were virtually impossible to fight back against. In their hands, planets could be crushed to pieces, and the mere brush of their fingers could wipe cultivators out of existence. Such unequaled power was completely shocking to Meng Hao, causing the thought of doing battle with beings like this in the future to become even more agonizing than before. At the same time, he refused to be cowed so easily and felt his heart surging. Who cares about these gods? They can still perish, which means that winning the war against them is still possible. They aren't invincible. Meng Hao's eyes flickered brightly, and his energy rose up, creating a vortex around him which swept out through heaven and earth. If I can absorb the power of the god's blood right here and now, then I can achieve a fleshly body breakthrough. I can rise from the peak of the ancient realm into the Tao realm. Back when he had completely extinguished all 5 soul lamps, the chi and blood which he had built up became stuck in a fleshly body bottleneck, making a breakthrough impossible. However, once he did achieve a breakthrough, that power would explode out and push him explosively into the Tao realm. Meng Hao had been waiting for a long time for this day to arrive. He took a deep breath, and without any further hesitation, made a beeline for the enormous god's forehead, toward the first star thereupon. In that location, a huge lake could be seen. Meng Hao flew like a meteor, causing rumbling sounds to echo out, distorting heaven and earth as he passed along. Wind screamed and thunder crashed. Nothing, be it illusory or corporeal, could do anything to hinder his progress. He pierced through every obstacle, and a brief moment later, he was in the air above the vast lake. Not pausing for a moment, he shot down into the lake itself. Almost as soon as he entered the water, a massive rumbling sound could be heard. The surrounding land shook violently, and the mountains vibrated as all the lake water shot up into the air, forming something like a column that rose high up into the air and then dispersed into a mist. Now a crater could be seen down below, deep and filled with faint, flickering light. However, that light was profoundly ancient and contained an indescribable power of chi and blood. A strange gleam shone in Meng Hao's eyes as he shot down toward the center of the crater and then sat down cross-legged. Then he stretched his hands out to either side and slapped them down onto the ground. Rumble! The ground quaked violently, and the sludge at the bottom of the lake vibrated for a moment before transforming into ash. Numerous crevices appeared in the land, most noticeably beneath Meng Hao. In the center of that crevice could be seen the light of an enormous star. That star actually spread out to cover the entire area of the lake, and emanated an incredibly ancient aura which began to speed toward Meng Hao. His hair whipped around him, and his clothing flapped wildly. At the same time, a bright light appeared in his eyes as he experienced the sensation of his fleshly body power rising rapidly. So it really has been here all along. Meng Hao lifted his hand up and then chopped it down into the ground. The power of his cultivation base exploded out as he shot, spear-like, down toward the star. As the ground trembled, Meng Hao frowned and then snorted coldly. The parrot flew out, transforming into the battle weapon which he stabbed down. As he did, the battle weapon extended, piercing further down into the earth. The ground was shaking with unprecedented intensity, as if a soundless roar were echoing out through heaven and earth. After Meng Hao pulled the battle weapon back up and emerged out of the soil, a drop of golden blood rose up through the gap to float in front of him. As the blood drop rose up, the land sank and withered as if it had lost some of its life force. As for the star, it seemed to grow dim. Meng Hao looked at the golden drop of blood and took a deep breath. Then, without any hesitation, he reached out, grabbed it, and shoved it into his forehead. Rumble! As soon as the golden blood touched Meng Hao, it coursed into him, filling him with sounds like rumbling thunder. His expression twisted, and he began to tremble as his body experienced heaven-shaking, earth-shattering transformations. His heart rate increased dramatically, and his blood pumped rapidly through his system. Even his bones emitted cracking sounds. It was as if he were being reborn, as if his flesh and blood were twisting around each other to pump out more power. Midst echoing rumbles, Meng Hao threw his head back and let out an astonishing howl. At the same time, his body grew, and his qi and blood surged. The land around him trembled, and far off in the distance, both Yuan Jian and the outsiders could sense a shocking aura which stirred their souls, coming from the direction of Meng Hao. This is the feeling I was going for. Meng Hao's eyes were bright red, and a vicious expression could be seen twisting his face. However, a gleam of excitement was visible in his eyes as he felt the level of this fleshly body increasing and sensed the indications of an imminent breakthrough. His bones were transforming, becoming stronger and more resilient. His flesh and blood were experiencing constant advancement, and a terrifying level of power was surging through him. It was a mad power that could destroy vast swaths of land. Every beat of his heart sounded like the crash of thunder. Still need some more. By this point, he had grown to nearly 30 meters tall, making him look like a mountain. Every inch of his flesh exuded a terrifying power. There were even magical symbols which bulged out all over his skin, radiating an ancient air as his body's energy rocketed up. A strange light gleamed in his eyes as he suddenly used the tiniest scrap of cultivation base power, not to teleport, but to leap up into the air. The ground beneath his feet shattered and collapsed in on itself as Meng Hao shot like lightning toward the location of the second star. It only took a moment for him to bear down on what was a convergence of masses of outsiders, who were arranged in formation around a violet-horned 5 essences outsider. The second star was actually located in a vast plain. The outsiders had obviously been here for some time, and had excavated a huge pit, at the bottom of which the violet-horned outsider sat cross-legged, absorbing the thin strands of blood-colored qi that were seeping up from the dirt. As he absorbed the blood-colored qi, he slowly became more powerful, and an aura similar to Meng Hao's was even beginning to build up within him. It was at this point that rumbling sounds filled heaven and earth, and a blur shot through the air at an indescribable speed, heading directly toward the pit in the middle of the plain. It was none other than Meng Hao. When he landed, the ground shattered, and countless shocked outsiders were hit by a powerful shockwave. Rumbling sounds rose up, along with miserable shrieks, as the shock wave swept over the outsiders, instantly reducing over 1,000 of them into ash. Further out, the outsiders who were able to avoid the brunt of the blast coughed up blood, having sustained serious injuries. Some were even sucked down into the collapsing ground. Meng Hao's expression was tranquil. Intense pressure radiated off of his 30-meter frame as he completely ignored the dying outsiders around him. A red glow could be seen in his eyes as he turned his head to look at the violet-horned outsider sitting off to the side. Even as he turned his head, the outsider's eyes opened, and without a moment of hesitation, he ceased absorbing the blood-colored qi and shot backward in retreat. "Think you can just leave?" Meng Hao said with a cold laugh. In the moment that the violet-horned outsider fell back, Meng Hao suddenly shot forward at incredible speed. In the blink of an eye, he was in front of the outsider, who suddenly found Meng Hao's hand gripping his neck. Even as the outsider bellowed in rage, the power of Meng Hao's cultivation base and fleshly body exploded out through his hand. The outsider tried to fight back, but his resistance was like a rotting weed against Meng Hao's blow. Meng Hao disregarded it completely and clenched down with his hand. The outsider didn't even have a chance to speak. A boom could be heard, and the violet-horned outsider's eyes bulged. Then, his entire body exploded, and all of the blood-colored qi which he had absorbed spread out, then bored into Meng Hao. Meng Hao lifted his right foot up into the air and then stamped it down. A boom echoed out as the land shattered, and a drop of golden blood flew up. He quickly grabbed it and pushed it into his forehead. This was his second drop of god blood, and it was not ordinary god blood, but rather soul blood. As it was absorbed into Meng Hao, he threw his head back and roared. His entire body, including his bones, his flesh and blood, and his internal organs, vibrated violently. At this moment, his ancient realm fleshly body broke through. Intense reverberations echoed out that could shake heaven and earth. Meng Hao's fleshly body power skyrocketed to such an extent that traces of numerous natural laws became visible around him. They were spreading out from his body, and they directly affected the world around him. "So this is a Tao realm fleshly body," he said, eyes glittering. He took a deep breath as his body grew once more, this time to 300 meters. Chapter 1330, Tao Lord Fleshly Body. I can still get stronger. Meng Hao suppressed the energy of qi and blood building up inside of him, not permitting it to fuse with his fleshly body. Instead, he looked off into the distance, his eyes gleaming with a bright light. As he shook his body out to limber it up, cracking sounds echoed out. A terrifying fleshly body power emanated out from him, and Meng Hao could sense that he was already several times stronger than before. Ignoring the surviving outsiders in the area, he once again leapt up into the air. The ground beneath him shattered, swallowing up the outsiders like a giant mouth. Miserable screams echoed out, but then vanished almost immediately. In the blink of an eye, Meng Hao sped through the air toward the location of the third star. This place was a tall mountain, and as soon as Meng Hao landed there, it shattered and collapsed. A huge crater opened up below, and a drop of golden blood flew up. Meng Hao grabbed it and, without pausing for a moment, absorbed it and then shot toward the fourth star. He appeared a moment later in the fourth area, where a swamp stretched out in all directions. As soon as he appeared, he slapped his hand down toward the swamp. The swamp was instantly destroyed, and the god blood concealed deep down below was extracted, shooting into Meng Hao's forehead. Meng Hao threw his head back and roared, and rumbling sounds could be heard as he grew even taller, instantly reaching 600 meters. His fleshly body now radiated incredible power. He could tell that he was now at the level of a Tao Lord. Tao Lord fleshly body. Meng Hao licked his lips. The good fortune he was acquiring here was incredible. It was power that could rend the heavens and crush the earth. It was as if he were being completely reborn. To him, the veil of the Godgrave was a place to completely reach a higher level. He took a deep breath, which caused wind and thunder to scream and everything to darken. With that, he stamped his foot down, and as the land was destroyed, he suddenly appeared at the location of the fifth star. There were also outsiders here, and they seemed prepared to face a powerful enemy. Their cultivation bases exploded with power, sending the entire area into chaos, exerting incredible pressure with a wide array of magical techniques and divine abilities. Numerous shocking shields surrounded a wizened 5 essences outsider, who was sitting there cross-legged, absorbing vast quantities of qi and blood. As he did so, his gaunt frame radiated an increasingly terrifying power. Even as Meng Hao closed in, rumbling sounds could be heard as the outsider's fleshly body suddenly broke through to the Tao realm. Only the best of the best among the outsiders had been sent into this place to acquire the good fortune of god blood, to increase their fleshly bodies to incredible levels. The outsider experienced the fleshly body breakthrough at almost the same moment that Meng Hao arrived. When Meng Hao landed, the ground shattered, blasting away in layers as a boundlessly domineering air spread out. All of the outsiders' divine abilities and magical techniques were shattered as a massive windstorm kicked up. Miserable screams rang out as the vast majority of the outsiders, unable to stand up to the power, were killed. Meng Hao turned and reached a claw-like hand out toward the wizened outsider. However, in that same moment, the outsider opened his eyes, which shone with brilliant light. He shot backwards, simultaneously unleashing a fist strike to meet Meng Hao's palm. A boom rang out. Meng Hao's expression was the same as ever, but the outsider coughed up a mouthful of blood, and a shocked expression appeared on his face. He immediately began to retreat at top speed. Meng Hao's eyes flickered coldly as he looked at the fleeing outsider. Having sensed the level of his opponent's fleshly body, he chuckled coldly, then unleashed his own fist strike. The Life Extermination Fist. This version of the Life Extermination Fist was completely different than the one he had been able to unleash before. Instantly, all of the life force in the surrounding 30,000-meter area was sucked away. A 30,000-meter area became a field of death. The outsider let out a wretched shriek and attempted to fight back. However, his life force was inexorably sucked away. Soon, the entire area had absolutely no life force in it, almost as if the natural laws in the area had been changed, as if life was incompatible with this area. All of the pressure of this field of death weighed down onto the outsider. Rumbling sounds could be heard as he let out a blood-curdling scream, and then exploded. As he exploded, his chi and blood dissipated. However, the bits of God blood within him shot toward Meng Hao, boring into him as if he were the lodestone of all God blood. Rumbling echoed out from inside of him as he grew even taller, and the power of his fleshly body increased until it was very close to the four essences level. Then he flickered, shooting like lightning toward the location of the sixth star. As Meng Hao sped along, this part of the veil of the Godgrave began to collapse, as if he were taking away whatever power it was that supported the head, as if the existence of this part of the dimension was now completely meaningless. Rumbling could be heard as the collapse spread. By that time, Meng Hao was at the location of the sixth star. Here could be seen another huge lake, except that instead of water, it was filled with lightning. As Meng Hao neared, the power of that lightning exploded out, converging together and surging toward him as if to overwhelm him. Meng Hao said. Eyes flashing, he looked at the lake of lightning and did nothing to avoid it. Instead, he plunged into the middle of it all. Rumbling could be heard as the lightning slammed into him. He shook his arms and legs and the lightning collapsed. However, it seemed endless, slamming into him relentlessly, over and over again. Meng Hao snorted coldly, then clenched his right hand into a fist and unleashed a fist strike onto the ground directly beneath the lake of lightning. It was not the life extermination fist, it was the bedevilment fist. The bedevilment fist had been unleashed onto the land. The ground trembled and crevices spread out. Meng Hao's eyes flickered with a red glow and his cultivation base rotated madly. Combined with the power of his fleshly body, it put his energy at something past what Lord White had been. In fact, it was no weaker than K. Siddhigarbha. This was the power of a six essences Tao sovereign. Rumbling rose up, and the ground collapsed. A gigantic crater appeared that was far larger than any of the previous craters, and the lake of lightning was completely swallowed up. Since the troublesome lake of lightning was attempting to block his progress just like the land was, Meng Hao decided to wipe them both away simultaneously. The lake of lightning faded away, and Meng Hao lifted his right hand, causing a golden drop of blood to rise up from the lands below, which he grabbed. Almost as soon as he touched the golden blood, a roar of rage suddenly seemed to echo out from down below. Meng Hao's eyes flickered. Even as the roar echoed out, he pushed the golden blood into his forehead. A tremor ran through him, and the signs of an imminent breakthrough once again erupted out. Rumbling sounds echoed out as Meng Hao grew to a size of not 600 meters but 1,200 meters. He threw his head back and roared, causing all light to dim. Ignoring the roar of rage directed against him, he shot toward the area with the seventh star. That location was covered by a dense forest, much of which had already been felled by the more than 10,000 outsiders in the area. Moments ago, all of them had been in the midst of kowtowing in the direction of a huge crater, in the middle of which was an aged outsider with dull scales. He sat there cross-legged, constantly absorbing the blood-colored chi from the ground. As of this point, his relentless absorption seemed to have drained the area of at least 90% of the chi there. In the same moment that Meng Hao destroyed the lake of lightning, this outsider patriarch's eyes snapped open, and they radiated with ancient and boundless cruelty. Suddenly, he said, "Sacrifice." As the words left his mouth, the surrounding outsiders unhesitatingly unleashed their cultivation bases in order to self-detonate. The self-detonation of over 10,000 outsiders created a towering force, which then transformed into a blinding light that obliterated everything in a 5,000-meter radius. At the same time, much of that power was absorbed by the outsider patriarch by means of some unknown technique. Meng Hao arrived in almost the exact moment that all the outsiders self-detonated. The blast itself would have seriously injured him, were it not for the fact that his fleshly body had just experienced a breakthrough into the five essences level. Even as Meng Hao closed in, a figure shot up from within the blast of the self-detonations, slamming a fist into Meng Hao's chest. Meng Hao lurched to a stop, a strange glow in his eyes. However, he didn't retreat but instead advanced, slamming forward in an attack. A muffled grunt rang out from the mouth of the shadowy figure who had just attacked him, and Meng Hao laughed coldly as he went in for another attack. Massive crashing booms rang out as the two of them exchanged hundreds of blows. Soon, the shadows which cloaked the figure began to slip away, revealing the outsider patriarch. By this point, however, he didn't seem as old as he had before. He had more life force, and his fleshly body power, which was at the Tao Lord level, when combined with this five essences cultivation base, made him similar to a Tao sovereign. No wonder you chose the seventh mountain and sea. Lord White-turned traitor, plus you plan to use this place to produce 3 experts on the level of a Dao sovereign. Meng Hao's eyes flickered with the realization that, if he hadn't come here for the same purpose as these outsiders, and arrived just in the nick of time, then they would have succeeded in their efforts, which would have been a catastrophe for the mountain and sea realm. The outsider patriarch's eyes flickered with killing intent, and yet inwardly he was afraid and backed up. He knew that he was not a match for Meng Hao, and therefore, since he couldn't get any more god blood from this area, he decided that he might as well just leave. Even as he began to back away, killing intent flared within Meng Hao's eyes, and he flickered into motion towards the old outsider. The outsider patriarch laughed derisively as he raised his right hand up into the air and made a ripping motion, causing a huge rift to be torn open in the sky. If I feel like leaving, nobody but a paragon can stop me. Instantly, he shot toward that exit rift at top speed. At the exact same time, a power of emptiness suddenly erupted out from him. It was none other than essence power. Essence of emptiness, the old outsider said slowly. Heaven and earth are not real. Nothing under a paragon can stop my teleportation magic. With that, he began to fade away into the rift. A moment later, Meng Hao's attack reached him, and it passed directly through him. Well, isn't this interesting? Meng Hao said, eyes flickering. He attacked again, but this time he performed an incantation gesture and then pointed up toward the heavens. Demon sealing hexing magic hex this dimension. 8th hex. 7th hex. 6th hex. 5th hex. 3rd hex. 2nd hex. Let's see how you get away now. The entire dimension was shaking in response to the wave of Meng Hao's finger. It was at this point that the outsider patriarch's face completely fell. Chapter 1331, God Curse. The 8th hex ceased all movement in the dimension. Everything went still and quiet. As for the 7th hex, it sealed the dimension's cycle of karma, freezing it within all memories. The 6th hex locked down life and death, replacing reincarnation, making the entire dimension like a tree without roots. The 5th hex threw everything into chaos. Inside became out, the universe twisted, heaven and earth went dark and all light faded. The 3rd hex caused the river of time in the dimension to slow to a halt. Time had no boundaries, no limits, no end, and yet the flow of time was stopped. The 2nd hex caused the emptiness to become reality. Amidst massive rumbling sounds, the outsider's face fell, and his body was forced out of its illusory state. The entire dimension went quiet as heaven and earth were sealed. As he appeared in the flesh, the outsider was shocked to find that he couldn't move. He was only able to hover there, motionless, his heart overwhelmed with fear as he looked at Meng Hao. What magical technique is this? This isn't full essence, but it contains the power of essence. Furthermore, if this becomes true essence, then this person, heal. He has the foundation of a paragon. His fleshly body is already at the 5 essences level, and with a cultivation base foundation like this, if this kid isn't stopped, he's definitely going to become a paragon. Even as the outsider reeled in astonishment, Meng Hao advanced with lightning-like speed. As he did, he extended his index finger, which stabbed into the outsider's forehead. Despair and rage boiled up in the outsider's eyes, and then his life force was exterminated. In the moment that the flame of his life force was snuffed out, the outsider's true form became visible in front of Meng Hao, a 3,000-meter-long lizard. The lizard radiated an aura of death, but that couldn't cover over his incredible ancientness. It was impossible to tell how many countless years this outsider had lived, and yet, even as his lizard body trembled, a drop of golden blood appeared on his forehead. Within that golden blood were flecks of black, which were vile impurities from the outsider himself. Meng Hao waved his hand, causing the golden blood to begin to burn. After the impurities were expunged, the golden blood flew toward Meng Hao and fused into his forehead. Rumbling sounds could be heard as Meng Hao grew taller. Although the growth wasn't very dramatic, the power his fleshly body radiated was more terrifying than ever. Everything around him distorted, as if the natural laws were being expelled. At the same time, a burst of 5 essences fleshly body power erupted from within him. Almost at the 6 essences level, madness gleamed in Meng Hao's eyes. 6 essences was the peak of the Dao sovereign level. For a long time, Meng Hao's fleshly body had been one realm higher than his cultivation base. However, it had eventually become stuck between the ancient realm and the Dao realm. Without god blood, that was a difficult gap to bridge. But now, if he were to be able to reach a Tao's sovereign fleshly body in one fell swoop, Meng Hao's battle prowess would be virtually incomprehensible. He would be in a position to actually tangle with paragons. As of this moment, he truly was the most powerful expert in the mountain and sea realm. Meng Hao took a deep breath as he released the dimension from the grips of the hexing magic. To seal an entire world in this way was not something he could sustain for more than a few breaths of time. Even still, it was something completely heaven-defying. Meng Hao could now clearly sense that his cultivation base and battle prowess were far beyond what they had been when the war had started. He was now incredibly powerful. Rumbling sounds could be heard as Meng Hao shot toward the region of the final star. This area was different from all of the other areas. It was not a mountain peak, not a plain, not a lake, but rather an enormous statue. A boundless mist covered the statue, which depicted a middle-aged man standing atop a star. He was dignified and imposing, with a river of stars in his right hand and a barbaric and domineering aura. As Meng Hao closed in, the statue's aura suddenly erupted into chaos, causing the mist to churn. At the same time, the statue's eyes suddenly turned golden. The statue's eyes radiated explosive light, and its voice was matchlessly cold and sinister as it said, "Those not of the God clan may not possess God blood. Anyone who steals God blood will be cursed for all time by the gods and will be exterminated." A majestic divine will erupted from the statue, a wave of hatred that swept out in all directions, enveloping everything, including Meng Hao. Meng Hao's face fell as the divine will swept over him, distorting everything in the world. It was as if the power of time travel were being unleashed, as if everything were becoming illusory. In the blink of an eye, everything became clear again, and the world from before was gone. There was no statue, no veil of the Godgrave, no mountain and sea realm. Stretching out in front of him was an endless starry sky, within which floated an enormous, shocking landmass, so large that it seemed comparable to the starry sky itself. Thousands of other smaller land masses floated beneath that main enormous land mass, upon which a war was raging. The flames of combat burned, and the sounds of fierce fighting rang out. Divine abilities thundered, giving rise to massive waves of sound. Meng Hao's mind was reeling as he looked at the huge continent. Although this was his first time seeing it in this specific way, there was a voice calling out from within his blood telling him that this was the Paragon Immortal Realm. Rumbling could be heard, and Meng Hao spotted a giant. It was huge, almost as big as the entire landmass, and behind it were more giants all striding forward. The giants were so terrifying that the single sweep of a fist could slay 1,000 cultivators, and the wave of a finger could destroy the heavens and extinguish the earth. The land masses that were the lower realms shattered one after another, but at the same time, the Paragon Immortal Realm was trembling violently. Fissures of destruction spread out, and yet the Paragon Immortal Realm continued to fight back violently. God blood rained out of the heavens as the giant gods were felled. Meng Hao's mind was reeling as he saw one of the gods, who had 8 stars on its head, suddenly turn to look at him. For some reason, this god's facial features seemed familiar. Meng Hao's pupils constricted, and his mind rumbled as he realized that it was the exact same god whose head made up the veil of the Godgrave. "God curse," murmured the 8-star god, killing intent flickering in his eyes. He suddenly veered out of the ranks of his fellows, bursting through the surrounding cultivators to head in Meng Hao's direction. Meng Hao was some distance away, but because of the enormity of the god, it was almost impossible to see him clearly with one glance. For someone that huge, it only took one step to reach Meng Hao. He strode across the entire starry sky to appear right in front of Meng Hao. A screaming sound could be heard, like a wild wind that caused heavenly bodies to tremble. And that was merely the god raising its hand. Its index finger extended, causing powerful ripples to spread out in all directions as it pierced through the starry sky. Rumbling sounds echoed out from the boundless destructive power emanating out from that enormous finger. It completely filled Meng Hao's field of vision, cutting off the starry sky, cutting off the entire world. An intense sensation of deadly crisis exploded up within Meng Hao, a sensation which seemed completely realistic. It didn't matter that Meng Hao had his real unreal hexing. To him, this felt absolutely real and not false. But that's impossible, he thought. What magical technique is this? This can't be real. This is an ancient war, and even if I was sent here somehow, it would be as an observer. My real body couldn't be here. Meng Hao's face flickered, but there was no time to consider the situation at length. As the finger closed in on him, he shot backward, unleashing the full power of his cultivation base and fleshly body. Unfortunately, all of that was useless. In the critical moment, Meng Hao then performed an incantation gesture and unleashed demon-sealing hexing magic. He didn't utilize all of the hexes but rather the most powerful, third hex. Presentation hexing. The Tao of Time was unleashed, causing Meng Hao's body to blur. He suddenly seemed to fade into the river of time, and the incoming finger passed through him. A boom rang out and blood sprayed out of Meng Hao's mouth. He felt himself weakening to the point where he was about to collapse into pieces. However, the Green Emperor's eternal incantation helped him recover, and he fell back at top speed, eyes glittering. It's real and also not real, illusory and yet not illusory. It's a dreamscape. If you die in a dream, you can die in real life. Having received inspiration in the nick of time, he suddenly extended his hand. Without any hesitation, he performed an incantation gesture to unleash karmic hexing, then touched his own forehead. Instantly, his karma threads appeared. Among the hosts of threads, he found one that looked different than the rest, the one that had appeared after absorbing the god blood, the karma thread connecting him to this god. The god might be dead, but because of the connection of this karma, he was still able to unleash his Taoist magic. Meng Hao grabbed a hold of the karma thread and was just about to rip it apart when the god suddenly looked at him. He had no time to attack, so instead, he opened his mouth and roared in Meng Hao's direction. The roar of a god. Are you mmmmblllly? The roar shattered everything between the god and Meng Hao. An incredible power of extermination roared toward him, inundating him. In that same moment, Meng Hao snapped the karma thread. Rumble. Everything went dark. Time passed. Eventually, things grew clear again, and Meng Hao was no longer in that ancient starry sky. He was back in the veil of the god-grave. The golden light in the eyes of the statue had faded away, and yet, an unyielding roar could be heard echoing about as the statue collapsed. Meng Hao's face darkened, and he coughed up a mouthful of blood. He was rapidly recovering, but even simply thinking about the danger he had just been in left him trembling. Not willing to let me steal the god blood, huh? Meng Hao looked at the shattered statue, and could sense that the god blood which had been there before was now gone. That very blood was what had been used to fuel the divine ability which had transported him back to ancient times. Meng Hao began to chuckle coldly, then waved his sleeve. Killing intent sprang up in his eyes. Well, even without the 8th drop of god blood, I can still acquire a Tao sovereign fleshly body. Chapter 1332, Extinguishing the 6th Lamp. Meng Hao's voice echoed out into the crumbling remains of the dimension. Because the region that held the 8th star had collapsed, the entire world was falling to pieces. The land sank in, and an enraged roar filled the air. Lightning continued to crash constantly, as if the end of days had arrived. As for Meng Hao, he floated there slowly in the air, neither touching the land nor rising high up into the sky. His hair floated around him and his clothes rippled. At the same time, a bizarre light shone within his eyes. It's time to converge. The chi and blood that I built up when extinguishing my soul lamps. He swished his sleeve, then tapped his right index finger onto his chest. That motion seemed to open up a stoppered hole of chi and blood inside of him. Rumbling echoed out, along with a furious sea of chi and blood power that exploded out ferociously. His physical frame, which was now hundreds of meters tall, looked even more majestic than before. At the same time, his fleshly body power rose rapidly. Although it didn't experience the same increase it had when absorbing god blood, it was still incredibly powerful. His heart began to beat faster and faster. His bones became stronger and more resilient. His flesh and blood buzzed with power, and increasingly intense rumbling sounds filled him. As of this moment, the level of his fleshly body increased yet again, passing into the mid-5 essences level. Meng Hao's eyes flickered as he lifted up his right hand again, this time pressing down onto his forehead. Rumbling could be heard as the second wave of chi and blood hidden within him burst out, filling him completely and causing his fleshly body power to rocket up. Still not enough. He performed an incantation gesture with his right hand and then pressed down onto his dantian. Chi and blood power erupted out, surging through him. He grew larger and larger. By now, he was nearly 1,800 meters tall and was terrifying to behold. By now, his fleshly body was in the late 5 essences level. I still have 2 batches of reserve power to unleash, he said, eyes shining brightly. He had chi and blood built up from 5 extinguished soul lamps, and so far had unleashed 3 of those batches. Now, it was without any hesitation that he performed an incantation gesture and pushed down on the top of his head. Rumbling sounds echoed out and Meng Hao's vision swam. At the same time, an incredible power of qi and blood exploded from the top of his head. As it filled his body, he threw his head back and howled. He grew taller, reaching 2,100 meters in height. He was trembling, his flesh and blood felt as if it would split apart, and his heart seemed to be on the verge of exploding. Heaven and earth twisted, and the air around him trembled as a violent aura expanded out. As of this moment, Meng Hao's fleshly body strength was equivalent to the peak of the 5 essences level. He was only a step away from being at the 6 essences Tao sovereign level. Once that happened, and he combined his fleshly body power with that of his cultivation base, his explosive battle prowess would put him at the peak of the Tao sovereign level. Although he couldn't be considered half a step into the paragon level, he would be very close to that. "Last one," he roared. Performing a double-handed incantation gesture, he simultaneously pushed down onto his chest and dantian. All of his power was unleashed, and it surged through him like an ocean. He was now 2,400 meters tall. At the same time, his skin ripped and tore, causing blood to shower down. Pain blasted through him, and were it not for his incredible willpower, he would definitely be unable to endure. He let out an intense howl as he reached 2,700 meters in height. The sensation of power that completely filled him left Meng Hao convinced that if he faced Lord White right now, he could defeat him with a single punch. One punch could shake the starry sky, one punch could shatter heavenly bodies, one punch could kill mountain and sea lords. Heaven and earth were filled with rumbling sounds and the dimension shook violently. Meng Hao could now sense a Tao. It was the Tao of power, a Tao of heaven and earth, something that he could just barely touch. However, he was still in the 5 essences level. He was able to sense that his fleshly body was still not in the 6 essences level. Were it in the 6 essences level, he wouldn't just be touching that Tao, he would be holding it in the palm of his hand. Only with power like that could he stand in the presence of a 7 essences paragon and be qualified to remain alive. In fact, he might even be able to strike fear into the heart of such a paragon. I can't believe a 6 essences fleshly body is so difficult to attain. However, the words already left my mouth. I'm definitely going to acquire a peak Tao sovereign fleshly body. Rumble. As the qi and blood power coursed through him, Meng Hao's body experienced continuous growth. By this point, he was fully 2,997 meters tall. It was a gap of only 3 meters, but that gap was like the difference between heaven and earth. That small gap of 3 meters would be as difficult to cross as the preceding 2,997 meters. 2,997 meters is 999 zhang. The final gap is only 1 zhang. Ancient lamps come forth. Meng Hao's eyes shone with a gleam of madness as he waved his sleeve, causing the air around him to vibrate as 33 soul lamps suddenly appeared. 5 were extinguished, 28 were burning. The light cast upon Meng Hao made him look like an immortal divinity. He swished his sleeve, eyes coming to rest on the 6th of the soul lamps. I've already passed the first of the 7 desolations. Next is the 2nd desolation, that of the fleshly body. I should be at the point of being able to extinguish this 6th lamp. Eyes gleaming with determination, and not hesitating for even a moment, he waved his hand toward the 6th soul lamp. Extinguish. His divine will erupted, and rumbling sounds could be heard as the 6th soul lamp went out. Instantly, vast quantities of green smoke appeared, which Meng Hao instantly absorbed. In the moment that the smoke entered his body, he began to shake. He suddenly felt as if his body were corroding. However, the intense withering sensation caused Meng Hao to smile. There was pain, but he had experienced worse pain than this in the past. Usually, the 7 desolations were something that would be passed with extreme caution in secluded meditation, with a Dharma protector on the outside. However, as he experienced the twinge of pain, Meng Hao became quite confident in being able to breeze through the first tribulation within the 2nd desolation. His fleshly body was so incredibly powerful that the fleshly body desolation couldn't shake it at all. His body continued to corrode, and his marrow vanished. It was as if there were a black hole inside of him sucking away at him, causing him to constantly wither. However, the withering didn't bother him at all. By this point, the dimension around him was crumbling completely. The lands were shattered, heaven and earth destroyed. The veil of the Godgrave was falling apart. Meng Hao took a deep breath. The withering of his flesh could do absolutely nothing to harm the power of his cultivation base and fleshly body. He reached his right hand out and made a grasping motion, grabbing onto Xianxia. Then he flickered into motion, crossing through the air to suddenly appear outside the veil of the Godgrave, in the starry sky of the seventh mountain and sea. Almost as soon as he appeared outside, the power of tribulation rumbled down, which was none other than the fleshly body Tao tribulation that came when one's fleshly body stepped into the Tao. However, there was something strange about the tribulation. Because of the war between the mountain and sea realm and the first heaven, or perhaps because of the mere presence of the first heaven, the Tao realm tribulation didn't come. Meng Hao frowned, pondered the situation for a moment, but then put the matter aside. Because of his current fleshly body, transcending tribulation wouldn't be difficult for him anyway, not even with the second desolation inside of him. Behind him, the altar that was the entrance to the veil of the Godgrave cracked and then fell apart. The dimension which contained the veil transformed into nothing more than ash. Xianxia was unconscious, but he pulsed with the aura of God blood. Even more noteworthy was that his index finger was now different than it had been before, and contained terrifying fluctuations. So that is the good fortune he sought, Meng Hao thought. Looking away, he flicked his sleeve, vanishing along with Xianxia. When he reappeared, he was back on planet Tiger Cage. After delivering Xianxia to the cultivators there, he left. With a final glance at the planet, he flashed out into the starry sky. He could clearly sense the terrifying fleshly body power inside of him, which vastly exceeded what he could unleash before. As he traveled along through the starry sky, he clenched his hands into fists, and everything around him trembled as powerful ripples spread out. The desolation will continue for a bit longer, then it will end. Based on Meng Hao's current trajectory, it was obvious that his destination was the fourth mountain and sea. He had a burning desire to see Su Qing. After he did, he would then attempt to accomplish something that would rock the mountain and sea realm, as well as all of the 33 heavens. If he succeeded, the spirit of the mountain and sea realm would rise, and his name would spread throughout the 33 heavens. Then everyone would know that in the mountain and sea realm there was a cultivator named Meng Hao. He looked up into the starry sky, then proceeded along, a beam of brilliant light that shot off into the distance. Soon, he was closing in on the barrier that separated the seventh and sixth mountains and seas. To Meng Hao, that barrier wasn't even worth mentioning. He pierced through, almost immediately finding an exit, which he blasted through to enter the sixth mountain and sea. This was his first time in the sixth mountain and sea, and although he was not familiar with the place, there was definitely an aura here that was very familiar. That was the aura of outsiders. Similar to the seventh mountain and sea, the sixth mountain and sea had been almost fully occupied by the outsiders. As he entered this mountain and sea, Meng Hao's body withered up even more, and he looked even more gaunt. However, his battle prowess was no less than before, and in fact was increasing. The end of the desolation was approaching. When that happened, his fleshly body power would erupt, and he would fully enter the Tao's sovereign fleshly body level. By now, he wasn't even paying attention to the desolation. He sent his divine sense out into the starry sky and could almost immediately detect countless black cubes. There was still fighting going on here, most especially in one particular region, where a truly bizarre conflict was underway. There could be seen a middle-aged man in a long violet robe. A shield of red light swirled around him, and his eyes were closed. His face was pale, as if he had been seriously injured, and he sat there cross-legged and completely motionless. Outside of the shield which protected him was an outsider who was currently attempting to break down the shield. Assisting the outsider was an old man. The old man's expression was tranquil, but when he looked at the other man inside the shield, his eyes flickered with avarice. Meng Hao recognized this outsider. It was one of the incarnations of that outsider Tao sovereign. And this version was clearly a clone. As for the old man assisting him, he was emanating a remnant of the power of the mountains and seas, ensuring that Meng Hao could instantly identify him. This man was a traitor just like Lord White had been. He was the Lord of the Sixth Mountain and Sea. Chapter 1333, Was I So Wrong? The Lord of the Sixth Mountain and Sea looked at the violet-robed man behind the shield and coolly said, Lord Wu, you must surely know you can't succeed. Why keep trying? 1. Lord Wu's surname is a character which, although a real Chinese surname, also means wizard. Incidentally, this is the only time that he is actually referred to by name in these next few chapters. The rest of the time he is referred to as the violet-robed man or Lord of the Fifth Mountain and Sea. Urgen does this pretty often with minor characters. In order to make the narrative flow a bit more smoothly, I'm going to use Lord Wu in most places, instead of the other two ways of referring to him. Off to the side, the outsider Dao Sovereign's clone smiled, and a flicker of derision appeared in his eyes. The violet-robed man inside the shield, Lord Wu, didn't respond. His eyes were tightly shut, and his face was pale white. Based on the cultivation base power swirling within him, he was obviously trying to achieve a breakthrough. Earlier, he had been fighting with the Lord of the Sixth Mountain and Sea, and the two of them were evenly matched. But then the outsider Dao Sovereign's clone suddenly appeared, and when he joined forces with the Lord of the Sixth Mountain and Sea, they were just too powerful. Lord Wu had been forced to put his own status as Lord of the Fifth Mountain and Sea on the line. He had shattered his mountain and sea crown to create the shield which was currently keeping him safe. Then he took advantage of the brief respite from the fighting to attempt to force a breakthrough. He knew that the only way to be able to continue fighting would be to break through from the 5 essences level to 6 essences. If he couldn't, then the mountain and sea shield he created would eventually fail, and he would be at their mercy. Now that he was inside the shield, he had few options. In fact, he was trapped, and the Lord of the Sixth Mountain and Sea and the outsider Dao Sovereign clone had far too many methods of slowly refining him. In fact, that was exactly what they were doing right now. Black flames emanated off of the clone, surrounding the shield. The raging inferno caused cracking sounds to ring out. Lord Wu was slowly being refined into a medicinal pill. The Lord of the Sixth Mountain and Sea laughed. You might have destroyed your mountain and sea crown, but you're still a mountain and sea lord. After refining you into a mountain and sea pill, I'll consume you and once again be able to wield the power of the mountains and seas. As soon as the first heaven descended, he had been stripped of his status as a mountain and sea lord. However, if he could consume Lord Wu, then he would once again be able to unleash mountain and sea power. When Lord Wu continued to ignore him, the Lord of the Sixth Mountain and Sea gave a cold snort. Stubborn fool. Lord Wu's eyes snapped open, and he glowered at the old man. I might be a stubborn fool, but that's better than being like you, a traitor to the mountain and sea realm. During the course of their battle, it had become clear that the Lord of the Sixth Mountain and Sea was not an outsider, but rather was a cultivator of the mountains and seas. When the Lord White of the Seventh Mountain and Sea defected, that was a completely different matter. He was an outsider in disguise, who had plotted and schemed his way into his position. The Lord of the Sixth Mountain and Sea, however, was a complete and utter traitor. Traitor, the Lord of the Sixth Mountain and Sea stood there quietly for a moment, then threw his head back and laughed. It was a sinister laugh, filled with madness and obsession. That's right, I am a traitor. So what? Considering my latent talent and good fortune, if I hadn't been born in the mountain and sea realm, and hadn't been held back by my status and bloodline, then I could have long since stepped into the 6 essences level. In fact, I might even be a paragon. I've practiced cultivation for 33,000 years. I'm a mountain and sea lord at the peak of the 5 essences level. Yet what does that get me? The mountain and sea realm is sealed by the 33 heavens, cursed, held back. The highest cultivation base is the peak of the 5 essences level. Was turning traitor for the purposes of increasing my cultivation base really so wrong? Cultivators practice cultivation for themselves. Who cares about one's family and one's people? Everything can be cast aside in the pursuit of a great Tao. To further my cultivation, I cast off all past karmic ties. Besides, the mountain and sea realm can't possibly win this war. A wise man submits to the circumstances. Can you really find fault with my choice? As the Lord of the Sixth Mountain and Sea spoke, his voice grew louder and louder until he was shouting. It was almost as if he wasn't speaking to the violet-robed Lord Wu, but rather himself. The outsider clone stood off to the side, laughing, and the scorn in his eyes grew deeper. Apparently, that scorn was directed not just at Lord Wu, but also at the Lord of the Sixth Mountain and Sea. The Lord Wu looked at the Lord of the Sixth Mountain and Sea, the pain in his heart visible on his face. With our home gone and our people gone, he said, what is the point of existing? He had known the Lord of the Sixth Mountain and Sea for 10,000 years and had considered him a close friend. And yet, this was how things were ending. You say we're sealed, and that's true, he continued, but that doesn't mean we're without options. Look at Ksitigarbha, he's the perfect example. Ksitigarbha, he controls reincarnation. The 4th mountain is unique. That's the only way he can sidestep the sealing of the 33 heavens, by means of the power of reincarnation. Considering he has his own Tao, he can even step into the Dao source. In all of the mountain and sea realm, who can do that besides him? Nobody, not a single person can step into the true Tao sovereign level. Well, there are those old-timers, but their chi and blood is on the decline, and they can only explode with power by harming their longevity. What good is that? As for me, I will leave the mountain and sea realm. I will become a cultivator of the 33 heavens. I might lose my position and my freedom, but at least I will have a great Tao. It won't take long. In a few thousand years, when the mountain and sea realm is gone, I will still be here. At the very least, I'll be a true Tao sovereign, but if luck is with me, I might be a paragon. I will definitely have an important place in the 33 heavens. The Lord of the sixth mountain and sea began to laugh loudly. Lord Wu could only look on bitterly. No matter how rapidly his cultivation base rotated, the gap separating him from the six essences level was too great. Actually, this was not the first time he had faced such a situation. It was over 10,000 years ago that he had first reached the point of being able to break through. However, despite trying on multiple occasions to do so, he had always failed. Even now, when everything was at stake, when he was stuck in a corner, he was still unable to force his cultivation base past that point. The ceiling of the 33 heavens was always there, radiating invisible pressure, which of course was why they were so arrogant. The outsider clone laughed heartily, a laughter filled with cruelty and scorn. He loved being able to watch two mountain and sea lords in such a mutually destructive scenario. One had turned traitor, the other was trying to break through. He just loved it. In the past, immortals had always seemed so aloof and remote, but now he could cause them to live or die on a whim. It was a wonderful feeling, and he couldn't get enough of it. Laughing, the outsider Tao Sovereign's clone turned to the Lord of the sixth mountain and sea and said, "All cultivators who capitulate to the 33 heavens will be qualified to make cultivation-based breakthroughs. Fellow Taoist Kang, perhaps it won't be too long before you're on equal footing with me." 1. Lord Kang's surname is a real Chinese surname which can also mean blue-green or cold. This is also the only time he is referred to by name, but to make things smoother I'm going to do the same thing with him as with Lord Wu. See above footnote. Finish refining this man and then consume the resulting mountain and sea pill. Help us to wipe out the rest of the mountain and sea lords. That will earn you quite a bit of merit. The Lord of the sixth mountain and sea, Lord Kang, took a deep breath. Then it was with excitement and other mixed emotions that he clasped hands and bowed to the outsider. More cracking sounds could be heard as rips and tears spread out across Lord Wu's shield. He then began to laugh bitterly as he realized that he had failed once again. "Like I said, there is no way you can succeed," Lord Kang said coldly. "What a stubborn fool. Other than K. Siddhagarbha, nobody in the mountain and sea realm can become a true Tao sovereign." With that, he swished his sleeve, apparently ready to begin consuming Lord Wu. However, even as the words he had just spoken continued to echo out, a cold voice suddenly spread through the starry sky. "You think that K. Siddhagarbha is the only one who can become a true Tao sovereign?" The voice came as a complete surprise to Lord Kang, and even the outsider clone, neither of whom had sensed anyone approaching. The outsider Tao sovereign's jaw dropped, and he turned his head. Lord Kang's eyes went wide. Cultivation base rumbling, he spun around. Even Lord Wu suddenly looked up. The gazes of all three immediately locked onto a figure who was approaching through the starry sky. It was a handsome young man in a long green robe with flowing hair. He almost didn't look like a cultivator, but rather a scholar. In fact, if he were wearing a scholar's traveling case, people would most likely think he was on his way to the imperial examinations. It was none other than Meng Hao. As he approached, no ripples spread out into the starry sky. And yet, natural's laws were wiped clean as he passed, and an indescribable pressure radiated off of him. He almost seemed like an enormous ocean, backed by huge waves which could crush down on anything. The first one to recognize him was the outsider Tao Sovereign, whose face flickered as he said, "Meng Hao." In the entire mountain and sea realm, the only person he feared, other than Paragon Sea Dream and K. Siddhagarbha, was this very person, Meng Hao. Back on the eighth mountain, one of his other clones had been killed by the combined efforts of Meng Hao and the Lord of the eighth mountain and sea. As for Lord Kang, this was his first time ever laying eyes onto Meng Hao. After sensing the fluctuations of Meng Hao's cultivation base, his eyes narrowed. Peak of 5 essences. Although Meng Hao was not a mountain and sea lord, he still had the power of the mountains and seas on him. And despite his lack of essences, Lord Kang's senses were telling him that Meng Hao was at the peak of 5 essences. The moment that Meng Hao appeared, the outsider's eyes flickered with killing intent, and he could sense the towering murderous aura emanating off of him. It was a murderous aura that no one else would be able to detect, a murderous aura that came into being because of outsiders. The only way someone could emanate such a murderous aura was to kill countless numbers of outsiders. "Are you looking to die?" the clone said. Leaping into action, he performed an incantation gesture, sending a black sea of flames out, filled with essence power. It became a huge black flame python, which lunged toward Meng Hao, maw gaping wide. "If you were here in your true form, I might be worried," Meng Hao said coolly. "But you're just a clone. You think you can stand in my way?" With that, he waved his arm. It was a casual gesture, but when his cultivation base rotated and his fleshly body power was unleashed, shockwaves spread out into the starry sky. The huge flame python seemed to slam into an invisible obstacle. It let out a miserable shriek and then completely exploded. The clone's face fell and his heart began to thump. However, he didn't back down. Instead, he flickered into motion, the scales on his body rising up and transforming into a windstorm. Lightning crackled and danced, thunder boomed, wind screamed, and rain went wild. A sea of flames roared up, and the power of emptiness raged, causing his body to turn illusory and merge with the powerful killing attack. The power of wind, rain, thunder, and lightning transformed into 4 vicious dragons. At the same time, the black flames turned into a face which shook the starry sky as it bore down on Meng Hao. Chapter 1334, Dao's Sovereign. Lord Kang could sense the pressure radiating off of Meng Hao. This was also the first time he had ever seen this outsider Dao's sovereign clone act in such a way. Therefore, he immediately joined him in the attack. His heart was thumping. He knew that he couldn't afford to underestimate Meng Hao, who left him in complete fear and trepidation. Without the slightest hesitation, he performed an incantation gesture, causing essence power to erupt out. All 5 of his essences were unleashed, the most powerful being the last, the essence of light. What was drawn upon was not the brightness of light, but rather the speed of light. As the lord of the 6th mountain and sea, what he had always excelled in was speed. He closed in rapidly, waving his hand, causing his essences to transform into divine abilities. Colors flashed in the sky, the stars trembled, and an enormous essence hand appeared, which grabbed at Meng Hao. Both he and the outsider were holding nothing back in their attack upon Meng Hao. They even used magical items. As for the outsider Dao's Sovereign, each and every one of his scales was just such a magical item, filled with shocking power that, when combined, could destroy heavenly bodies. The former lord of the 6th mountain and sea had magical items in the form of 2 pearls, both of which were crimson. They swirled around him, transforming into 2 red meteors that shot forth, emanating incredible pressure. Rumbling echoed out as these 2 powerful experts simultaneously tried to kill Meng Hao. Meanwhile, Lord Wu sat anxiously behind his shield. However, Meng Hao's expression never changed from its usual calmness. He eyed the 2 approaching enemies, then smiled. All of a sudden, he found himself thinking about how he had entered that ancient illusory world within the veil of the Godgrave, and had seen that enormous god who had roared at him in fury. "The roar of a god," he murmured softly. As the outsider and the old man closed in, his eyes suddenly shone with a strange gleam, and he opened his mouth. All of a sudden, the power of his fleshly body exploded out, unimpeded by either the second desolation or the power raging from the extinguishing of his soul lamp. A mighty roar erupted from Meng Hao's mouth. However, no sound could be heard. Apparently, his voice was too loud for there to be sound, so loud that no natural law could affect or resist it. The starry sky shattered, and the heavens seemed to be on the verge of vanishing. In fact, this sound completely exceeded the level that could be heard by either cultivators or outsiders. A shockwave ripped out, shredding the void as Meng Hao let out a roar that originated in ancient times, but echoed out in the present. In the blink of an eye, innumerable ripples appeared, distorting the void in front of him, transforming into a tempest that sent everything shaking as it slammed into the outsider Dao's Sovereign and the lord of the 6th mountain and sea. The outsider clone coughed up a mouthful of blood. He felt as if he were about to be ripped apart, and he screamed. However, that scream was completely drowned out by the powerful roar, forcing him to revert to his lizard form, which was thousands of meters long. That was the only way he could make a stand, and yet he was still shoved backward relentlessly. As for Lord Kang, he was even less equipped to deal with the roar. Blood sprayed out of his mouth, and his flesh and blood were instantly mangled, to the extent that his legs were shredded to pieces. Even the bones were transformed into nothing but ash. It was only thanks to the incredible speed with which he retreated that he was able to escape as he did. Had he been any slower, he would have lost more than only his legs. Violet-robed Lord Wu sat behind the shield, mind spinning, eyes wide. He could do nothing but stare at the valiant and terrifying Meng Hao, at the utterly bedraggled Lord Kang, and at the wretched outsider Dao's sovereign clone. It was also in this moment that the clone's magical items, the scales, all cracked and shattered into ash, completely destroyed. The Lord of the Sixth Mountain and Sea's 2 pearls were also shattered, and transformed into a red powder that instantly faded away. 6 essences, Dao's sovereign. The Lord of the Sixth Mountain and Sea felt his mind spinning. All thoughts of his injuries faded away, and he didn't even notice his magical items being destroyed. His mind was battered by enormous waves of shock as he stared at Meng Hao. He simply couldn't imagine how any cultivator could unleash such shocking and terrifying power, unless they were a 6 essences Dao sovereign. As he shook, he couldn't help but recall the words he had just spoken about 6 essences Dao sovereigns. And yet, here he was facing just such a person. This is impossible. Impossible. The mountain and sea realm is sealed. Siddhigarbha used the power of reincarnation to bypass the seal, but other than him, nobody can break through it. The outsider clone was also trembling as he looked at Meng Hao, his eyes flickering with terror. He was even considering whether or not he would have the confidence to take down Meng Hao with his true form. Such power was virtually unimaginable, compared to what he remembered of Meng Hao back in their encounter in the 8th mountain. He was now at least 10 times more powerful. How could this be possible? Even as these 3 powerful figures were reeling in shock, Meng Hao's face suddenly went pale, and he coughed up a mouthful of blood, not because he was injured, but rather because the second desolation tribulation had reached a critical point and was about to conclude. Once it concluded, his fleshly body would truly enter the 6 essences Dao sovereign level. It seemed that his attack just now had drawn on his fleshly body's power, thus giving the second desolation an exploitable opening. However, Meng Hao didn't care. His fleshly body was so powerful that he could still control the tribulation even when attacking. Not even the power of extermination from his 6th soul lamp's desolation could cause much of a problem. "Sorry, I'm not a Dao sovereign yet," Meng Hao said coolly. In that moment, the outsider Dao sovereign's eyes flickered. "He's injured. Attacking like that actually injured him. If we keep going, we can worsen the injuries. He will die today." The former lord of the 6th mountain and sea had been in a state of despair and had lost the will to fight. However, after seeing Meng Hao cough up some blood, his eyes flickered, and hope once again burned inside of him. Without any hesitation, he shot forth an attack. Lord Wu of the 5th mountain and sea suddenly let out a powerful roar as he attempted to break out of the shield to assist Meng Hao. However, it was in that moment that Meng Hao smiled coldly. Instead of backing up, he took a step forward, clenching his right hand and unleashing a fist strike upon the outsider clone. Rumbling could be heard as the life extermination fist sucked up the life force of everything in the area, then slammed into the outsider, who then tumbled backward, his body on the verge of collapsing. Meng Hao licked his lips in anticipation. Because of how he had just unleashed his fleshly body power, the desolation inside of him once again surged. However, a mere thought on his part suppressed it down to almost nothing. "It's almost over," he said. Laughing, he turned, flexing his hand as he suddenly appeared in the path of Lord Kang. The old man's expression flickered, and his eyes went wide. He had no time to unleash a divine ability, nor any time to fall back. Biting his tongue, he spit out some blood, which transformed into a blood mist. Inside that mist could be seen countless vengeful spirits which screamed as they charged Meng Hao. However, Meng Hao's fist passed right through them, almost as if it existed in a different time and space. Filled with a will of bedevilment, the fist appeared directly in front of Lord Kang. With one fist, heaven and earth were shattered. The Lord of the 6th mountain and sea's entire body exploded, leaving behind only his head, which let out a miserable howl as it fled in the opposite direction. "I'll let you live for the moment," Meng Hao said softly. "I want you to see for yourself that in the mountain and sea realm, it's not impossible to become a Dao sovereign." With that, he looked up into the sky, then raised both hands aloft as if he wished to embrace the stars. Then he took a deep breath, causing a wind to kick up and the entire mountain and sea realm to tremble. It was in that moment that the very last scrap of the second desolation faded away. Meng Hao had completely extinguished his sixth soul lamp, pushing his flesh and blood into that last, final step. RUMMMBLLLE. Meng Hao began to grow larger, 30 meters, 300 meters, 600 meters, 900 meters, 1,200 meters, 1,500 meters. Massive rumbling sounds could be heard. The majesty of what was happening caused Lord Kang to be rendered completely speechless, and the mind of the outsider Dao sovereign to reel in shock. The entire mountain and sea realm was shaking, as if it were bearing witness to something that hadn't happened for countless years, the appearance of a second true Dao sovereign. It might only be a fleshly body Dao sovereign, but that was a Dao sovereign nonetheless. RUMMMBLLLE. Meng Hao rapidly increased in height, 1,800 meters, 2,100 meters, 2,400 meters, 2,700 meters. It kept going and going. As he grew larger, his aura rocketed up, filling the sixth mountain and sea and even stretching out into the adjacent mountains and seas. As of this moment, the 9 mountains were shaking. As of this moment, the sun, moon, and other heavenly bodies were shining radiantly. As of this moment, Meng Hao was rising from 2,700 meters all the way to 2,790 meters, then 2,910 meters, then 2,997 meters, only 3 more meters. 3,000 meters. 3,000 meters, the true Dao sovereign level. It was in that moment that the 9 Chunwu turtles all began to howl. The will of the mountain and sea realm, which had spread out to fill the entire starry sky, began to stir. Everyone who was fighting in the war, regardless of which side they were on, could sense that something consummately powerful was in the sixth mountain and sea. From now on, I, Meng Hao, am a true Dao sovereign. Although Meng Hao spoke softly, his voice cracked like thunder. He stood there 3,000 meters tall, skin covered with magical symbols, radiating infinite power. He clenched his fists almost as if he were grabbing onto the starry sky, grabbing onto destiny, grabbing onto heaven and earth. Expand. The 9 mountains and seas were shaking. The 9 Chunwu turtles in their celestial ponds were howling, and the will of the mountains and seas, which had formerly been spread out in all parts of the mountain and sea realm, was now converging upon Meng Hao. At the apex of the starry sky were 2 figures locked in combat. One of them wore white robes and was none other than Paragon Sea Dream. Her face was ashen, but as she performed her incantation gestures, shocking, explosive power was unleashed upon her opponent, the outsider, 7 Essences Paragon Egu. Even after all the time that had passed, they were still fighting. However, as soon as Meng Hao entered the true fleshly body Dao sovereign level, Sea Dream's eyes began to shine with a strange light. As for Paragon Egu, his face completely fell. This is impossible. Siddhagarbha was able to break through because of his mastery over reincarnation. But Meng Hao, damn it, he's 9 Seals' successor, the future lord of the mountains and seas. Oh, you didn't know, Sea Dream said coolly, preventing the outsider Paragon from breaking free of combat. At the same time, back in the 4th mountain and sea, Su Qing was there, coordinating a deadly counteroffensive against the outsiders. All of a sudden, her heart trembled and she looked in the direction of the 6th mountain and sea. After a moment, a warm smile broke out on her face. There was another battlefield in the 4th mountain and sea, where a spectacular, astonishing fight was underway between Siddhagarbha and the 1st Heaven's Imperial Lord. That Imperial Lord's cultivation base was clearly the most powerful of anyone except for the Paragons, being at the peak of the 6 Essences level. He was half a step into the Paragon level, and yet Siddhagarbha was also completely extraordinary. The wave of his hand could cause numerous underworld palaces to descend. His incantation gestures unleashed the mighty power of reincarnation. The yellow springs which flowed beneath his feet made it seem as if he could control all life or death. He was able to fight the Imperial Lord on equal footing, although that was mostly because of his control of external forces, and because he had the home field advantage. Even still, it was obvious why for countless years Siddhagarbha had been known as the most powerful person in the mountain and sea realm. As of this moment, Siddhagarbha could also sense Meng Hao's explosive Dao sovereign energy coming from the 6th mountain and sea. Even as the outsider Imperial Lord's face flickered, Siddhagarbha's eyes gleamed, and he threw his head back and laughed uproariously. It had been years since he had noticed how extraordinary Meng Hao was, and at that time he had chosen to sow goodwill with him. He had taken Su Qing as his last and final apprentice, and she had not let him down. In the end, she had proven to be a rare genius when it came to strategy and tactics, and had been appointed as the commanding general of the entire Fourth Mountain and Sea. And then Meng Hao had gone and become a true Dao sovereign. Caesidigarbha's boisterous laughter made the imperial lord's mood sink even further. Meanwhile, back in the Ninth Mountain and Sea, on planet South Heaven, Shui Dongliu was still standing on that mountaintop. Suddenly, he turned his head in the direction of the Sixth Mountain and Sea, and a smile broke out on his face. At long last the day has arrived, Dao's sovereign fleshly body. Perhaps there is hope in this mountain and sea realm war after all. Sighing, he flicked his sleeve. Mountain and sea realm, begin analysis and replication. What a pity nothing like this happened back in the First War. If it had, perhaps the Paragon immortal realm would not have been defeated so tragically. Back in the Sixth Mountain and Sea, the 3,000-meter-tall Meng Hao threw his head back and roared. Mountain and sea power descended, filled with will of the mountains and seas, which swirled around Meng Hao and then bored into him. It was probing him, analyzing him, a sensation which Meng Hao found very strange, and yet did not interfere with. Instead, he simply looked down at Lord Kang of the Sixth Mountain and Sea and the outsider Dao sovereign clone. The clone's face was ashen, and his scalp was tingling. Without the slightest hesitation, he began to fade away and escape. He knew that he was no match for Meng Hao now. Meng Hao's terrifying power left him in complete despair. Dao's sovereign fleshly body, damn it, that's even more difficult to attain than a Dao sovereign cultivation base. How did he do this? Wait, there's God blood aura. He absorbed God blood. The clone was almost gone. Trembling, he realized that even if he were here in his true form, he still wouldn't be a match for Meng Hao. After all, Meng Hao's full power wasn't just reliant on a powerful fleshly body. His cultivation base, his magical techniques and divine abilities, all of them were terrifying. However, just when the clone thought he was about to escape, Meng Hao's eyes flickered, and he raised his right hand in a grasping motion. A rumbling sound could be heard as the void around the clone shattered and caved in, as if a giant, invisible hand were crushing him. Meng Hao, the 33 heavens will exterminate your entire clan, will wipe out everyone in the mountain and sea realm. A miserable shriek rang out, filled with unending hatred, as the outsider Dao's sovereign clone was completely obliterated. Meng Hao ignored his cries, turning instead to look at Lord Kang. Dao's sovereign, the man said bitterly. He had a hard time even uttering the words, considering what he himself had said just moments ago, that it would be impossible for another Dao sovereign to appear in the mountain and sea realm. And yet, right now, he was standing directly in front of none other than a Dao sovereign. He suddenly felt completely at a loss. For the sake of his own cultivation base, he had betrayed his home and his people, and now that all seemed like a mistake. In his bitterness, Lord Kang closed his eyes and asked himself if everything he had done had been worth it. No answer came. In almost the same moment that he closed his eyes, Meng Hao extended his right hand and waved his finger toward the head that was all which remained of Lord Kang. A boom echoed out as that head was crushed out of existence. The Lord of the Sixth Mountain and Sea was completely and utterly dead. Off to the side, Lord Wu emerged from within the shield. It was with mixed emotions that he watched Lord Kang die. Finally, he sighed. "What a waste," he said, shaking his head. Then he looked at Meng Hao, clasped hands and bowed deeply. "I am the Lord of the Fifth Mountain and Sea. Greetings, exalted Dao Sovereign." Just when Meng Hao was about to respond, he said, "E." He suddenly realized that the will of the mountains and seas had ceased to suppress the invading outsiders, and instead was completely focusing on him. It was as if the will of the mountain and sea realm was inside of him, replicating his fleshly body. It wasn't a complete and perfect copy, but rather about 80% pure. When it was finished, it dispersed, then once again spread out to cover the entire mountain and sea realm. Suddenly, each and every cultivator of the mountain and sea realm began to experience fleshly body transformations. In that brief instant, all of the cultivators' fleshly bodies experienced a complete redoubling of power. It didn't matter the level of their cultivation base or fleshly body. This advancement had nothing to do with their own power. It was a blessing from the mountain and sea realm, like a massive field of influence, within which all the cultivators' fleshly bodies were completely changed. The characteristics of Meng Hao's fleshly body were now being passed on to all of the cultivators of the mountain and sea realm. As of that moment, the countless cultivators of the mountain and sea realm on the numerous battlefields suddenly gaped in shock. They could sense the sudden change and were instantly enlivened. Even Lord Wu, who was standing directly in front of Meng Hao, suddenly trembled as the blessing strengthened him too. Is that the power of the mountain and sea realm? Meng Hao thought. A tremor ran through him, and as for Lord Wu, he stood there gaping for a moment before excitement rose up in his heart. Meng Hao was equally excited. He knew that this transformation was the key, not just to fighting this first battle with the 33 heavens, but also the final war with the two foreign powers. Am I the only one who can do this? Is it because I'm the future lord of the mountain and sea realm, or because I'm the successor of Paragon 9 Seals, or is it because of my all-heaven Tao immortal blood? Meng Hao's eyes glittered. There was no immediate explanation. Looking down at Lord Wu, he clasped hands, then slowly shrank in size back to that of an ordinary person. They did not spend time in idle chatter. Lord Wu immediately headed to the nearest front of battle. As a mountain and sea lord, he had his own important responsibilities. Meng Hao also had his own matters to attend to, and transformed into a beam of colorful light that shot off into the distance. He sped along toward the fifth mountain and sea, unobstructed. He could pass through the barriers between mountains and seas even when he was in the midst of the desolation tribulation. There was no need to even mention what he could do now that he had a Tao, sovereign fleshly body. Within the mountain and sea realm, his fleshly body was definitely at the absolute peak. A single step took him through the barrier, and he appeared in the fifth mountain and sea, where bitter fighting was underway. However, because of the blessing bestowed by the will of the mountain and sea realm, which came from Meng Hao's Tao sovereign fleshly body, the gap between the outsider cultivators and the cultivators of the mountain and sea realm was ever shrinking. Meng Hao could tell that with his current fleshly body power, he could crush and ignore natural law. He could alter the starry sky and even bend space and time. So this is what a six essences Tao sovereign is like, huh? He murmured. One essence beyond this is the paragon level. It was as if his own body were a starry sky, with his organs being the heavenly bodies. It was like an endless cycle. It was as if, even if heaven and earth were to be destroyed, he would not be. It was as if, even if heaven and earth were to wither away, he would not. Stepping into six essences made one's longevity equal to the heavens. Stepping into the true Tao sovereign level made you incomparable. Meng Hao didn't tarry in the fifth mountain and sea. He sped along and was soon nearing the fourth mountain and sea. As the barrier approached, his mood rose and fell constantly. At long last, he was approaching the fourth mountain and sea. At long last, he would be able to see Su Qing again. Back when everything started, when he left the ninth mountain and sea, how could he ever have imagined that the road would stretch to this extent? War had begun, the first heaven had descended, and the mountain and sea realm had been thrown into chaos. At the same time, he could never have imagined that with fleshly body power like this, he would be able to traverse the 9 mountains and seas as easily as if he were walking across the courtyard of his residence. Su Qing, I'm here, he murmured. A single step and he was across the barrier. He was in the fourth mountain and sea. Chapter 1335, Su Qing, I'm here. Chapter 1336, Reuniting as planned. The fourth mountain and sea controlled the cycle of reincarnation in the mountains and seas. Everyone who died in the mountain and sea realm would enter the Yellow Springs, which became the river of reincarnation that led to the fourth mountain and sea. There, the newly arrived spirits would be guided into the cycle of reincarnation, where they would eventually find a new home. There were many myths and legends regarding the fourth mountain and sea. It was a mysterious place, one that most people could never fully comprehend. The only thing most people knew was that the mountain and sea realm's peak expert resided there. His name was K. Siddhagarba. He was the lord of the fourth mountain and sea. He controlled the underworld and he controlled reincarnation. Even among mountain and sea lords, he held a preeminent position, and that was because essentially, he controlled the lives of everyone in the mountain and sea realm. The fourth mountain and sea was an important node, which allowed the realm to form a complete cycle. This was Meng Hao's first time coming to the fourth mountain and sea, and as soon as he entered, he could sense a very faint, and yet very pure, aura of death. Or perhaps it would be better to say that it was not an aura of death, but an aura of yin. At first glance, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The starry sky and the vast expanse seemed the same, and yet if you looked closely, you would see that the whole world appeared to be gray. Meng Hao looked around silently, then sent his divine sense spreading out to cover the entire fourth mountain and sea. However, there was one region in particular in which two powerful beings were fighting bitterly. That was the location where Siddhagarbha was fighting the outsider imperial lord. Meng Hao's divine sense immediately provoked a reaction from both of them. As for the outsider imperial lord, he reacted with rage, and he clearly wished to break free from the fight to try to slaughter Meng Hao. However, Siddhagarbha prevented that. Furthermore, he spoke in a completely calm tone that brimmed with self-confidence. "So you're Meng Hao," the outsider said. "Fellow Taoist Meng," came the voice of Siddhagarbha, "I can handle this outsider." Meng Hao smiled. When war descended, flowers would bloom on all parts of the tree, not just on one branch. Furthermore, one person alone could not change the entire war. No, that required a group effort. Meng Hao clasped hands and bowed toward Siddhagarbha, then focused his divine sense on where the cultivators of the fourth mountain and sea were battling the outsiders. Millions of outsiders could be seen, as well as millions of cultivators from the fourth mountain and sea. What was being fought was a spectacular and unprecedented battle. Meng Hao saw Su Qing there, surrounded by rings of guards. She hadn't been injured in the slightest, and in fact, was constantly sending orders out to all parts of the battlefield. Because of that, the cultivators of the fourth mountain and sea occupied the clear advantage on this front. Although he was a vast distance away from Su Qing, when Meng Hao looked at her, she could sense it. She turned her head and looked off into the distance, and somehow her gaze met his. In that moment, Meng Hao's heart trembled. As he looked at Su Qing, numerous memories rose up within him. There was the time on Mount Daqing when they had met for the first time. Then the time in the Reliance sect when he had given her the cosmetic cultivation pill. In the Black Civ sect's ancient blessed land, he had found her, trembling and helpless. Outside of the Black Lands, where Chuman-Tai had descended from the sky, the two of them had killed the Jai clan quasi-ray cultivator, and when they parted, tears had welled up in her eyes. Meng Hao would never forget any of those things. In the rebirth cave when he was dying, Su Qing took care of him, even sacrificing her own life force for him, all to give him a chance at another life. Even if her own soul dispersed, she was willing to pay that price for him. She even allowed herself to be imprisoned in the Black Civ sect. During their red wedding, Meng Hao held her in his arms, watching her fade away. He cradled her as she passed into death, and the entire time, she only cared about her dream of marrying him. Meng Hao trembled as the memories flitted through his mind like wind and lightning, causing his whole world to shake. He had come to keep his promise. He had come. 1. Here is a quick breakdown of all the Su Qing references. Mount Daqing, Chapter 1. First Cosmetic Cultivation Pill, Chapter 12. Black Civ Sect Blessed Land, Chapters 151-152. Killing Jai Clan Cultivator, Chapter 306. Su Qing sacrifices her life force for Meng Hao, Chapter 689. Meng Hao learned Su Qing is being held by the Black Civ sect, Chapter 694. Red Wedding, Chapter 772. He had promised to find her, even if he had to travel to the furthest reaches of the mountain and sea realm. No matter what dangers he faced, he would find her and would once again stand at her side. She promised to wait for him. If a life or a lifetime was not enough, then she would wait for him through all lives and lifetimes. Other than his parents and sister, there was no one in his life for whom he would do so much. There was no woman whom he would worry so much about, nor anyone that could occupy such an eternal place within his heart. Although he didn't realize it at the time, back on Mount Daqing when he saw her, the desire had already been planted within his heart, to be with her forever, through all lives and lifetimes. Elder Sister Su. She was not spectacularly beautiful, but in Meng Hao's eyes and his world, she was the most beautiful thing in heaven and earth. She didn't have a complicated heart, and the source of that was not any lack of intelligence, but rather the fact that she liked things to be simple. And so did he. When he was most tired, most exhausted, simplicity was a quiet harbor within which to rest his soul. Her smile, her voice, her eyes, everything about her, were firmly rooted in his heart and made him smile. "I know in my heart that the person I fell in love with is not just a fond memory but you," he murmured. "The real you. I know that I love you." With that, he took a step forward. Unbeknownst to him, someone had appeared behind him at some point, a shadowy figure clad in a long black robe. That figure was now watching him make his way off into the distance. It was none other than Slaughter. When Slaughter saw how Meng Hao looked at Su Qing, a flicker of reminiscence appeared in his eyes, as if he were considering some matter from the past, as if he was being reminded of himself. As Meng Hao walked forward, the world vanished. Heaven and earth faded away, natural law dispersed. Only one person remained, his wife Su Qing. He had come from afar, passing through each of the great mountains and seas. He had proceeded along through the starry sky, step by step, and was now walking onto the battlefield. There were outsiders who were in his path, but it wasn't because they were trying to stop him. Rather, he happened upon them as he proceeded toward the heart of the fighting. A destructive power surrounded him that caused any outsiders who approached within 30,000 meters of him to scream and explode. Meng Hao paid them no heed. He proceeded along, surrounded by shouts of astonishment. As the outsiders fell back from him, a strange scene developed on the battlefield. With every step he took, he was surrounded by empty space, as the outsiders fled from his presence. The cultivators of the fourth mountain and sea looked on with vigilance. Even though Meng Hao's arrival caused the death of the outsiders around him, they were still cautious. There were only two people who had different reactions. One was the echelon cultivator of the fourth mountain and sea, Lin Kong. The other was, of course, Su Qing. Lin Kong stood in the crowd, wearing a gray robe. As he thought back to everything that had occurred in the windswept realm, he sighed. A wry smile could be seen on his face, and mixed emotions filled his eyes as he sighed. 1. Meng Hao fought and killed Lin Kong in Chapter 1105. Of course, they reconciled later, and when they parted ways in Chapter 1151, Meng Hao gave him a cosmetic cultivation pill to deliver to Su Qing. So he finally came. Su Qing was smiling radiantly. She stood there in the army of the fourth mountain and sea, in the command pavilion, watching as Meng Hao approached. She remembered everything that had occurred, just as he did. Those memories could not be wiped away from her because of her reincarnation. She had always believed that one day, her beloved companion, her husband, would come from the distant ninth mountain and sea to find her. It didn't matter how long it took or how far away he was. It wouldn't even matter if a war was being fought. Nothing would be able to stop him. He would definitely come. And now he had. Su Qing bit her lip and took a step forward, much to the shock of the surrounding cultivators from the fourth mountain and sea. Some of them wanted to stop her, but as Meng Hao neared, they suddenly lost the ability to control their cultivation bases. The battlefield went quiet, and soon only Meng Hao and Su Qing were there, looking at each other, slowly drawing closer. Time seemed to slow down. The outsiders and the cultivators of the fourth mountain and sea both watched as Meng Hao approached. Su Qing stepped out of the command pavilion, and the two of them were soon standing together. "I've come," he said, reaching out to grasp her hand. This was his wife and his lifelong love. "Yes," she replied, her face flushing a bit. It took a bit of courage on her part, but she resisted the urge to look down shyly. Instead, she allowed her joy to radiate out, and she looked into Meng Hao's eyes and smiled. This was indeed the happiest moment she had experienced since being reincarnated. When Meng Hao saw Su Qing smile, he couldn't stop himself from smiling. His hands tightened around hers and hers around his. It was as if neither of them wished to ever let go. However, they both knew that the time they could spend with each other was short. No matter what they wished inside, they would have to let go. Su Qing had her duties, and Meng Hao had his mission. This was not the time and place. If only things could go back to how they were before the deadly war broke out in the mountains and seas. Meng Hao sighed. Su Qing looked around at all of the cultivators from the fourth mountain and sea and the outsiders, and slowly loosened her grip. "I can't go with you right now. Wait for me. If the day ever comes when this war ends, then we can go home together." Su Qing suddenly stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, resting her head on his chest to hear his heartbeat. After a long moment passed, she looked up at him and said, "I'll wait for you and you wait for me. We'll both be on the lookout for each other." Su Qing bit her lip, then pulled away from Meng Hao's embrace and returned to the command pavilion. As Meng Hao looked at Su Qing, he realized that there was something different about her from before. Much like himself, she had grown up, she had become mature. Meng Hao's heart was calm. Su Qing had her duties and he had his mission. After looking at her deeply one last time, he waved his hand, sending a bit of divine will swirling out to surround her. He took a deep breath and then looked up into the sky at the vast land mass up above that was the first heaven. Gradually, the warmth in his eyes faded away, to be replaced by icy coldness. The air around him grew icy, and his aura sharp and dangerous. "There's something I have to go do," he murmured. "Something that will lift the spirits of everyone in the mountain and sea realm." Rumbling sounds could be heard as he suddenly shot up into the air, leaving the battlefield. He became a streak of light like a shooting star, passing out of the fourth mountain and sea, up into the vast expanse above. He was now heading toward the first heaven, which had superseded the starry sky of the mountain and sea realm. He was going to destroy the first heaven. Few people noticed how he was flying up into the sky. However, it was certain that a massive storm would soon shake heaven and earth. A storm was coming, a storm which would be caused by none other than Meng Hao. Chapter 1337, Destination, First Heaven. Meng Hao was a blur that shot from the fourth mountain and sea up into the starry sky, toward the land mass that was the first heaven. Not a single regret could be found in his heart. He was completely determined, maddened, enlivened with the idea of enacting the rise of the mountain and sea realm. He was attempting to do something that could shake heaven and earth. He was attempting to destroy the first heaven, the home of the invaders. He was attempting to set the blood of the mountain and sea realm aboil. All of the cultivators locked in battle would be able to look up and see the destruction of the first heaven. Some people might think that an act like that would have little meaning and couldn't compare to Meng Hao slaughtering outsiders on the field of battle using his cultivation base. However, the truth of the matter was that this plan was utterly and profoundly meaningful. Currently, the people of the mountain and sea realm were in the midst of despair. After having been suppressed for tens upon tens of thousands of years, they had then been invaded. They had long since lost the dignity they had once had during the days of the Paragon immortal realm. In that age, its cultivators had been valiant, but when complete and utter catastrophe struck, it was as if their Tao hearts had been shattered. After the initial catastrophe, they were then completely sealed by the 33 heavens, stifling any recovery that their Tao hearts might have experienced. After two such mighty blows, their valiance waned, and they didn't dare to take the fight to their enemy. For a people to rise up, their spirits needed to be kindled, and it was the same when the time came for a homeland to ascend. Meng Hao knew that he was only one person. Even if he became a paragon, the course of such a monumental war was something he couldn't change on his own. He needed to stir the minds and hearts of the cultivators of the mountain and sea realm. He needed to awaken within them the valiance that had once existed in the paragon immortal realm. Back in those days, there had been a saying, "Any who assault the immortal world will be put to death." When Meng Hao destroyed the first heaven, similar words would once again be heard in the mountain and sea realm. Any who assault the mountains and seas will be put to death. The mountain and sea realm was on the brink of annihilation. Looming directly behind them was a bottomless chasm. There was nowhere to retreat to. That meant that the only thing to do now was rise to prominence. Meng Hao's eyes shone with a bright light. His mind, his thoughts, his cultivation base, everything about him was completely focused. He was like a shooting star, like a flaming torch, like a brilliantly shining lamp. He was a lamp that did not seek to illuminate the starry sky of the mountain and sea realm, but rather sought to kindle the spirits of the cultivators therein. Kindle a fire that would exist forever and never be extinguished. He rose higher and higher, flew faster and faster. He was a beam of light, scintillating brilliantly, the center of all attention. The first people to notice him were the cultivators of the fourth mountain and sea. They stared blankly at Meng Hao as he rose up, and at first, no one was really sure what he was doing. However, as he picked up speed, the people down below realized that he was heading, not toward the starry sky itself, but toward the spot where the starry sky ended, toward that which weighed down upon the hearts and minds of all mountain and sea realm cultivators. The first heaven. What is he doing? He's heading toward the first heaven. This. Gasps could be heard from within the huge army of the fourth mountain and sea. Every moment, more and more cultivators' faces flickered with astonishment and shock. Su Qing stood atop the altar, trembling, her head tilted up to look at Meng Hao climbing up into the sky, charging toward the heavens. A strange flicker could be seen in her eyes, which slowly turned into a bright glow. Although she was worried, she suddenly felt an incredible sense of pride. This was the love of her life, her man. The forces of the fourth mountain and sea were soon in a complete uproar. He's heading for the first heaven. He's going up to destroy the first heaven. But can he do it? Equally shaken were the outsiders, who stared blankly at Meng Hao, almost unable to believe what they were seeing. Also in the fourth mountain and sea were Xianxia and the outsider imperial lord, who were fighting fiercely, causing rumbling booms to echo out. Xianxia's eyes suddenly began to shine brightly as he realized what Meng Hao had in mind. The outsider imperial lord gaped, and his face flickered. At the same time, Paragon Sea Dream was fighting with the outsider Paragon Egu. They also noticed what Meng Hao was doing. Paragon Sea Dream's face broke out into a wide smile, and Paragon Egu's face fell. At this point, Meng Hao reached such an incredible speed that he was like an arrow. backed by mountain and sea power to shoot rapidly toward the first heaven. However, only the cultivators of the fourth mountain and sea could see him. He was currently too far away from the other mountains and seas for anyone there to spot him. However, as he flew along, his eyes glinted, and he suddenly waved his right hand. Suddenly, a ball of light flew out. This was none other than his own supernova magic, which immediately began to suck in all the light around it, and thus grow even brighter. 1. Meng Hao created the supernova magic in chapter 942. He used it in battle a few subsequent times, notably when fighting Guru Heavencloud in chapter 1159, and when fighting the giant in the Divine Flame world in chapter 1179. He wanted all of the cultivators in the entire mountain and sea realm to witness what he was doing. One little sun was not enough, so he waved his hand, and dozens of little suns appeared. There were more than 100 of them swirling around, shining with increasingly scintillating light. Still not enough, Meng Hao growled. As he continued to shoot toward the first heaven, he performed a double-handed incantation gesture, then waved his hands out in front of him, causing more little suns to appear. 100, 300, 500, and soon, Meng Hao was surrounded by 1,000 little suns. 1,000 little suns, absorbing heaven and earth, sucking in all the light of the starry sky. They rapidly grew larger and more dazzling, until Meng Hao himself actually looked like a sun. Majestic light shone out, to the point where the cultivators of the third and fifth mountains and seas could look up into the sky and see a new sun. The cultivators in the third mountain and sea were in the midst of fighting the outsiders, and yet everyone looked up in shock. What's that? A sun? That's not possible, but it really does look like an actual sun or moon. At the same time, cultivators in the fifth mountain and sea looked up and gasped in disbelief. Wait, no, there's a person inside. Impossible. The outsiders were equally taken aback. Up in the starry sky, down beneath the first heaven, Meng Hao was surrounded by 1,000 spheres of light. His expression was one of unswerving determination as he came to the conclusion that 1,000 little suns wasn't enough. He needed more. He threw his head back and roared, pushing onward with greater speed, and yet simultaneously waving his hand, causing another 1,000 little suns to appear. 2,000 little suns were shining radiantly. They were now densely packed together, each one of them emanating blinding light. However, from a distance away, the light of those 2,000 small suns merged together, to make them look like the glow of one enormous sun. Rumbling sounds echoed out as the 2,000 little suns swirled around Meng Hao. He flew higher and higher, away from the mountain and sea realm, growing ever closer to the first heaven. Soon, the cultivators in the second and sixth mountains and seas could see the brightly shining sun up above. Although it currently looked like little more than a dot of light, within the pitch blackness, it was extremely conspicuous. In the second mountain and sea, the cultivators and outsiders were fighting a particularly bloody battle, and the reek of gore had permeated the entire mountain and sea. The vast army of cultivators had suffered setback after setback, and the roars of the outsiders filled the entire starry sky above them. However, even as despair wrought at the hearts of the cultivators, in the moment when they had no hope, and were bitterly convinced that they were going to lose the battle, all of a sudden, a bright dot of light appeared up above. That light became the only thing the cultivators of the second mountain and sea looked at. That dot of light. Heavens, considering how far away we are, that dot of light must actually be enormous. What's going on? The cultivators of the second mountain and sea were completely abuzz. Although they couldn't actually see Meng Hao, somehow they could all sense that within that light was someone emanating an incredible willpower and utter determination. The sixth mountain and sea was equally in an uproar. That light is heading in the direction of the first heaven. Considering how far it is away, the fact that we can see it moving up means that its true speed must be mind-boggling. Although the Lord of the sixth mountain and sea had been killed, the violet-robed Lord Wu of the fifth mountain and sea was now fighting in the battle, and at long last, the cultivators were able to launch successful counterattacks against the outsiders. Lord Wu was the first one to look up into the starry sky. His jaw dropped, and he instantly began to tremble. It's him, he's going to destroy the first heaven. His eyes began to shine, and suddenly a surge of indescribable excitement rose up within him. Soon the other cultivators of the sixth mountain and sea caught sight of the light up above, and they were completely shaken. Although not everyone could immediately discern where that dot of light was heading, people quickly began to deduce the truth. He's heading toward the first heaven. Even as the cultivators in the second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth mountains and seas were staring fixedly at the dot of light. It suddenly grew twice as bright as before. Along with the eruption of brightness, the light also grew in size. That was because the number of little suns surrounding Meng Hao had increased from 2,000 to 4,000. There's a person inside that light. By now, virtually all of the experts in the great mountains and seas were able to discern what was happening. Their hoarse exclamations were heard by those around them, and soon everyone's minds were spinning. It was at this point that the cultivators in even further mountains and seas could see that high up above the 9 mountains and seas, there in the starry sky, was a sun. Although it wasn't the true sun, by now everyone could see it. A sun above the mountain and sea realm. In the 7th mountain and sea, Yuan Giant suddenly opened his eyes. He had been sitting there in meditation, but when he heard the exclamations ringing out, he looked up into the sky and then suddenly felt as if he were being struck by lightning. He couldn't quite see who it was inside that light, but his intuition told him exactly who it was. It's Meng Hao. It's definitely him. He's going to lift the spirits of an entire people by destroying the first heaven. Shaking, he shot to his feet, panting excitedly, eyes burning with anticipation. Expand. The dot of light couldn't illuminate every inch of the starry sky, and yet, as of this moment, it was visible to all cultivators from the 1st to the 7th mountains and seas. In the 7th mountain and sea, planet Tiger Cage was in an uproar. It was the same in the 1st mountain and sea. There, Echelon cultivator Dao Heaven stood in the midst of his army, looking up at the brilliant dot of light and was completely shaken, as was everyone around him. From the 1st mountain and sea all the way to the 7th, the cultivators were looking up at the brilliant dot of light as, all of a sudden, it erupted with even further brilliance. Massive rumbling sounds echoed out as the dot swelled in size by double. It was in that moment that the number of little suns surrounding Meng Hao increased from 4,000 to 8,000. 8,000 little suns, radiating intense light. Although that light couldn't match the light of a real sun, it was the most dazzling heavenly body visible. The cultivators were in an uproar, and the outsiders were shaking inwardly as intense feelings of foreboding rose up inside of them. The outsider Tao sovereign, who had split apart into numerous incarnations, was shaking, and his eyes shone with astonishment as he stared at the light. The outsider imperial lord who was fighting K. Siddhigarbha also felt his heart pounding. It was the same with the outsider paragon Egu. In sharp contrast, K. Siddhigarbha, Sea Dream, and the various mountain and sea lords seemed to be suddenly inspired, and burst out with all the power they could muster to prevent any of their outsider opponents from breaking free of the battle. Roars echoed out and booms filled the air. When the number of little suns around Meng Hao increased to 8,000, the cultivators in the 8th mountain and sea could finally see the sun up above. Cultivators and outsiders alike felt as if the battle going on in the 8th mountain and sea was like a giant millstone crushing down onto them. But then, the cultivators noticed that bright light, and their jaws dropped. What's that? How could there suddenly be a spot of light? Hold on, it's rising up into the sky at incredible speed. Could it be some sort of magical item? It looks like it's heading toward the first heaven. As the crowds burst out into a commotion, Meng Hao's grandfather, the lord of the 8th mountain and sea, suddenly shivered. He looked up, and when he saw that light, his eyes suddenly flickered in surprise. Hayar's aura, that's Hayar. He threw his head back and laughed uproariously at the sudden feeling of joy which swept through him. As he continued to watch the dot of light rising up, his eyes began to gleam with anticipation. Suddenly, the number of little suns around Meng Hao once again increased dramatically. No longer were there 8,000. Instead, there were 10,000. The light of 10,000 little suns merged together as they rocketed toward the land mass up above. At long last, the light became clearly visible in the 9th mountain and sea. Pill Demon saw it and the members of the Fang clan saw it. Meng Hao's parents saw it and his grandma Meng and her people saw it. Fatty, Chen Fan, Fan Donger, Sun Hai, Fang Yu, and everyone else he knew, all cultivators of the 9th mountain and sea could see it. The flames of war burned just as hot in the 9th mountain and sea as everywhere else, and the fighting was just as bloody and bitter. However, as soon as that light became visible, the people who were familiar with Meng Hao could sense that it contained his aura. That's Meng Hao. Heavens, how is this possible? Wait, how come looking at that light suddenly makes me think of Meng Hao? Could it be that it's really Meng Hao? The crowds were exploding into a huge commotion. On planet South Heaven, Shui Dongliu stood atop that mountain peak, still looking up into the sky. Suddenly, he began to laugh, a laughter filled with happiness and anticipation. It seems I picked well. He who shall counter the tribulation. Meng Hao. A warm expression could be seen on Shui Dongliu's face as he continued to laugh and stand there waiting. As of this moment, all of the cultivators in all of the 9 mountains and seas were watching. At the same time, Meng Hao was drawing ever nearer to the land mass that was the first heaven. He was now approaching the highest point in this region of space, and his speed caused rumbling to echo out as he closed in. His eyes burned with determination as he got closer and closer. However, even as he neared the first heaven, the figures of a vast number of outsiders suddenly appeared, flying out from it to meet him. In addition to that, numerous shields sprang up to protect the land mass. This land was the home of the outsiders, so it went without saying that they would have protections in place for it. More and more outsiders kept approaching, bent on stopping Meng Hao. Meng Hao's lips twisted into a cold smile. Just when he was about to attack, he suddenly frowned. Simultaneously, the outsiders who had just flown out suddenly fell back into retreat. That was because, all of a sudden, the explosive power of Tao Tribulation had appeared. This was Meng Hao's Tao Tribulation, his fleshly body Tao Tribulation. The tribulation had appeared before but hadn't fully descended. Instead, it had been hidden away, which as far as Meng Hao could tell was because the will of the mountain and sea realm had helped him to get rid of it. But now here it was again. That could only mean that this was tribulation, not from the mountain and sea realm but instead from the first heaven. It is its own world with its own life forms, Meng Hao murmured. Naturally, the first heaven has a will just like the mountain and sea realm. Tribulation is caused by a disturbance in karma. It saw the tribulation karma which was sown upon me and therefore took it upon itself to ensure that there was a reaping. He understood and yet wasn't afraid. Instead, he began to laugh. In his life, he had transcended heavenly tribulation on numerous occasions. Each one of those occasions had been of incredible difficulty, and yet now, he was completely confident that he could crush this instance of heavenly tribulation as easily as a dried-out log. Rumbling could be heard as tribulation clouds built up, massing together in front of Meng Hao. The rumbling of tribulation lightning could be heard as countless lightning bolts suddenly shot toward Meng Hao. Virtually all of those lightning bolts appeared to be humanoid in shape and filled with power that could destroy the heavens and extinguish the earth. As they closed in, they transformed into a sea of lightning that spread out wide in all directions, completely enveloping Meng Hao and his 10,000 sons. Down in the 9 mountains and seas, all of the cultivators could see what was happening. Not good. The first heavens is a complete world with its own tribulation power. If that dot of light is Meng Hao, then he's going to be defeated. Damn it, could it be that the first heaven is really impossible to fight? Cultivators were crying out in alarm all throughout the 9 mountains and seas. They were nervous, anxious, worried, and all of those feelings arose because of Meng Hao. Of course, there were some people in the crowd who looked on coldly. After all sorts of people existed within the mountain and sea realm. Naturally, there were some who believed that once disaster struck, everyone would die. There were even some sects and clans who actually weren't going all out in the fighting, but were instead hiding their true strength, looking for an opportunity to escape from the mountain and sea realm. In fact, there were even some people who were secretly planning to surrender to the 33 heavens. However, those people were in the minority. The vast majority of the cultivators of the mountain and sea realm were unyielding. They had their dignity and would never give in. Those cultivators were the ones who were nervously looking up into the starry sky. The outsider imperial lord who was fighting Ksitigarbha suddenly began to chuckle with scorn. Tribulation karma has been sown, and yet he dares to try to trifle with our first heaven. He's definitely courting death. Similar words were uttered by Paragon Egu to Paragon Sea Dream. The outsider Tao sovereign clones who were battling the mountain and sea lords were the same. All of them were sighing in relief. Some people were anxious, some people were derisive. However, it was in that very moment that Meng Hao, facing the boundless tribulation lightning, suddenly raised his hand. Eyes gleaming, he performed an incantation gesture and pointed out. Hex. 8th demon sealing hex. Rumbling could be heard as the power of his fleshly body exploded out. His cultivation base surged, and the 8th hex was unleashed, backed by the power of the mountains and seas. Instantly, everything began to shake violently. As Meng Hao waved his hand downward, all of the tribulation lightning in the starry sky suddenly stopped moving. Seventh demon sealing hex. Meng Hao waved his finger again, this time unleashing karmic hexing, severing the tribulation lightning's karma, and then swishing his sleeve. Fifth demon sealing hex. Inside-outside hex. Go back from whence you came. Meng Hao waved his sleeve, and instantly all of the tribulation lightning swiveled, changing directions to shoot toward the very tribulation clouds they had emerged from, moving at a speed which defied imagination. Massive booms rang out as the countless tribulation clouds collapsed into pieces. It was a heaven-shaking, earth-shattering sight as the tribulation lightning bolts smashed into the clouds, completely and utterly pulverizing them. This sight provoked a collective gasp from cultivators and outsiders alike. Eyes went wide and jaws dropped in disbelief. "What?" exclaimed the outsider Dao Sovereign incredulously. All of the outsiders were completely and utterly shaken by Meng Hao. That bright spot of light was now nothing less than a complete nightmare for them. It was at this point that enraged howls could be heard from the landmass that was the first heaven. More tribulation clouds rolled out, converging together into one gigantic cloud mass that seemed bent on completely eradicating Meng Hao. Massive pressure emanated out from the tribulation clouds, which surrounded Meng Hao and caused the starry sky to shake. As the enraged howling continued, it was possible to see an enormous claw taking shape inside of the tribulation cloud. That claw was pitch black and covered with scales, like the claw of a lizard. After all, this tribulation was not from the mountain and sea realm, but rather from the world of the first heaven. The claw was covered with boundless tribulation lightning, the intensity of which vastly exceeded that from before. The claw shot toward Meng Hao, and as it did, more and more tribulation clouds converged in the area, causing the tribulation to become even more majestic and boundless than before. Meng Hao's expression was the same as ever, and his eyes shone with a bright light. Without pausing for a moment, he shot toward the tribulation cloud and the lightning-covered claw. As he neared, he suddenly spoke in a voice which sounded like booming thunder. "Did I say you could converge here? Disperse." Massive rumbling could be heard as the second demon sealing hex appeared. Real unreal hexing erupted out toward the tribulation cloud, transforming what was real into what was unreal, and transforming the unreal to the real. All Meng Hao had to do was think. As of this moment, he changed the tribulation, which was real, into something unreal. The converged tribulation was instantly dispersed. Chapter 1338, Tao Tribulation Comes. As of this moment, all eyes were completely fixed upon Meng Hao. Even as the words left his mouth, he flicked his sleeve, unleashing the second demon sealing hex. Rumbling sounds filled heaven and earth, and the starry sky trembled. Simultaneously, the land mass that was the first heaven was also shaking, as were the previously awe-inspiring tribulation clouds. The gigantic lizard claw and its boundless tribulation lightning suddenly became illusory and began to fade away. Moments later, the seemingly infinite tribulation clouds also began to fade away. After becoming illusory, all Meng Hao had to do was speak a single word, and his will caused everything to transform from being real to not. To the shock of cultivators and outsiders alike, as of this moment, Meng Hao's fleshly body Tao tribulation was over. It had been concluded using a method none of them had ever seen or heard of before. "Impossible." The outsider Imperial Lord fighting Xianxia suddenly let out a miserable howl. He simply couldn't believe what he was seeing. As far as he was concerned, it was a complete impossibility, and yet here it was occurring right in front of him. He suddenly burst into motion in an attempt to go stop Meng Hao, but in response, Xianxia laughed coldly, causing underworld palaces to descend and the yellow springs to sweep out. The river of reincarnation surged, making it completely impossible for the outsider Imperial Lord to do anything. Elsewhere in the starry sky, a similar situation was occurring with Paragon Sea Dream. She went all out with her cultivation base, even incurring serious injuries to herself, to prevent the maddened outsider Paragon Igu from breaking free. Igu bellowed in rage, eyes burning with killing intent as he sent divine sense rolling out to crush Meng Hao, and yet he couldn't get past Sea Dream. "Sea Dream, I don't want to kill you. Don't walk into your own death." "Don't make me laugh," Sea Dream responded, yet again obstructing his path. The 9 mountains and seas, which moments ago had been completely silent, suddenly burst out into a huge commotion. The cultivators of the mountain and sea realm were crying out and cheering, their voices merging together into a sound wave that surged out in all directions. As for the outsiders, they were completely shocked, and yet their will to fight was not reduced, and they continued to do battle. And yet, everyone, including the outsiders, was still watching Meng Hao as he closed in on the first heaven. He shot onward at top speed, surrounded by 10,000 little suns which radiated intense light. Closer and closer. Countless outsiders flew out from the first heaven and charged toward Meng Hao. Numerous scintillating shields were set in place. However, as the outsiders approached, Meng Hao's hands flashed in a double-handed incantation gesture. Then he stretched his hands wide and clapped them together violently, sending a burst of cultivation-based power out directly into the outsiders and directly toward the first heaven. "Suns, detonate," he roared. Instantly, the 10,000 suns surged into action, flying directly toward the outsiders and the shields protecting the land mass that was the first heaven. Boom! 10,000 suns all detonated. Each and every one of those little suns had been bolstered by Meng Hao's cultivation base power, and as such, their combined power was completely and utterly shocking. A massive explosion rippled out that shook lands and rocked mountains, that destroyed heaven and earth, that directly ripped apart the starry sky. A terrifying shockwave then began to spread out in all directions. That shockwave was so huge that it was visible even in the ninth mountain and sea, and it filled all hearts with shock. The vast numbers of outsiders who had flown out to stop Meng Hao, regardless of their cultivation bases, were swept over by the shockwave caused by the detonation of 10,000 suns. Blood-curdling screams rang out as their bodies were transformed into ash. Even the nascent divinities which attempted to flee were completely eradicated. Rumbling could be heard as the shockwave then slammed into the shields protecting the first heaven. In the blink of an eye, the shields began to shatter bit by bit. They immediately began to repair themselves but were clearly weakened. However, in the end the shields were too strong. Even the detonation of 10,000 suns could not completely destroy them. And yet, a tiny opening had appeared. That was all Meng Hao needed. He waved his arm and the battle weapon appeared, transforming into a black beam that stabbed directly into that weak spot, preventing the shields from recovering. All of this happened so quickly that no one could react. Meng Hao moved as fast as lightning, sweeping the battle weapon out so that a huge rift was torn open in the shield and the land mass that was the first heaven. Then, he stepped through that rift, to the surface of the first heaven. By this point, the cultivators of the mountain and sea realm had been whipped up into a frenzy. As for the outsiders, their faces were ashen and filled with dread. The imperial lord roared, the paragon howled, and the Tao sovereign's incarnations were trying unsuccessfully to merge back together. In the instant that Meng Hao set foot into the first heaven, he bolstered his voice with his cultivation base and cried out, "Mountain and sea cultivators, fight to the death." In response, all of the cultivators of the mountain and sea realm joined their voices together in response. It almost seemed planned, but it was. The first to respond was the fourth mountain and sea. The cultivators who clustered around Su Qing were already chomping at the bit. The first heaven hadn't been destroyed yet, but Meng Hao's sudden explosive success had kindled the spirits and souls of all of the cultivators there. Once the first heaven was actually destroyed, that spark which had been lit would explode into an inferno. Mountain and sea cultivators, fight to the death. The shouts of one cultivator after another in the fourth mountain and sea rang out, like the bellowing of war horns calling everyone to a final battle. As they did, they charged forth, smashing into the surrounding outsiders. Soon, such cries filled the air throughout the fourth mountain and sea. The eyes of all cultivators were shining brightly, and everyone felt as if they were bursting with incredible power. Soon, all of the voices in the fourth mountain and sea joined together into one mighty call. Mountain and sea cultivators, fight to the death. Meng Hao was using one simple phrase to bring all of the 9 mountains and seas into one united mountain and sea realm. As the voices echoed out in the fourth mountain and sea, similar cries rose up in the third and fifth mountains and seas. Massive waves of sound were crashing out, and were joined by the second, first, sixth, and seventh mountains and seas. All voices cried out, filled with passion and inspiration. Mountain and sea cultivators, fight to the death. That one phrase embodied the spirit of the mountain and sea realm. There would be no retreat. Enough was enough. They had been suppressed to the limit, and now was the time to give voice to their rage. They did not agree to be exterminated. They did not agree to die. They did not agree for the mountains and seas to vanish. This was the voice of a people who did not agree to back down. This was the voice that marked the awakening of a people. Mountain and sea cultivators, fight to the death. Finally, the voices could be heard in the 8th mountain and sea, and then the 9th mountain and sea. All of the 9 mountains and seas, the entire mountain and sea realm, was filled with one unified voice. The ordinary outsiders trembled, the Tao sovereign was shocked, the imperial lord was shaken, the paragon was flabbergasted. As of this moment, the people of the mountain and sea realm were using their battle cry to tell the outsiders, "We are not to be underestimated. You might have suppressed us for tens upon tens of thousands of years, but we are still the mountain and sea realm." Note from Deathblade: this chapter is a bit shorter than normal, coming in at around 1400 English words instead of the usual 2000 or so. Urgen made no comment about that in his chapter release, although he did do 4 updates on that day, this being the second. Chapter 1340, To Exterminate This World. At the very end of the starry sky within the first heaven, Meng Hao looked around, at a world that was very different from what he had imagined. He saw mountains and rainbows, plains and oceans. The spiritual energy here was abundant, 10 times more so than in the mountain and sea realm. In fact, there wasn't just spiritual energy, there was abundant immortal qi, making the entire place seem like a celestial paradise. Luxuriant vegetation covered the surface of the land, and a blue sky stretched out in all directions. Cities and other edifices were everywhere, although they floated about in the air instead of being constructed on the ground. Immortal mountains could be seen, as well as waterfalls of stars that seemed to connect heaven and earth. The edifices were all exquisitely constructed and gargantuan. They were ancient, filled with a boundless sense of time and history. Statues could be seen, and precious materials were available everywhere. So this is the first heaven, Meng Hao thought, feeling a bit shocked. Suddenly, a cold light flickered in his eyes and his cultivation base erupted. Fleshly body power surged out and he began to grow taller. In the blink of an eye, he was 3,000 meters tall. He had a Tao sovereign fleshly body which could shake heaven and earth, and taking a mere step could shake lands and rock mountains. When his cultivation base power spread out, the Paragon Bridge appeared, radiating a pressure of extermination that caused the sky to flash with brilliant colors. There were hordes of outsiders here guarding the first heaven, and yet none had very high cultivation bases. It was with complete shock that they all looked toward Meng Hao. An ancient voice suddenly spoke from off in the distance. "Who are you? What are you doing?" Clouds and mist rolled together to form into a huge face that stared at Meng Hao. "I'm Meng Hao," he replied softly, "from the mountain and sea realm. I've come today to exterminate this world." With that, he clenched his hand into a fist and punched down toward the ground. That single fist strike caused the entire world to shudder and crack as the power of extermination spread out. It was none other than the life extermination fist. The power of that blow caused the lands of the first heaven to shake. The shaking wasn't violent at first. It was like the shaking caused when a mayfly alights onto a leaf. However, at the same time, all of the plants and vegetation nearby on the surface of the land instantly withered and died. It was as if the life force had been sucked out of them. A gray shockwave spread out from Meng Hao's fist, and everywhere it passed, things withered. The outsiders' faces fell when this happened, and the ancient face was filled with shock. However, before it could say anything, Meng Hao swished his sleeve, and a boom could be heard as the mist face collapsed. Meng Hao's eyes were now shining with a cold glint. To him, no cultivators lived here, only animals. From what he could tell, virtually all of the outsiders in this world, including the ones with the power to take humanoid shape, were all just lizards. Although the buildings and the environment looked like the immortal world, Meng Hao knew that this place, was more like an animal den. Animals like you want to exterminate the mountain and sea realm. Meng Hao shook his head, then unleashed another punch toward the land beneath his feet, then pulled his hand back and punched again. The second punch was the bedevilment fist, and the third was the god-slaying fist. As the lands trembled, the Paragon Bridge crushed down, causing cities and edifices which floated in the air to shake violently and list to the side. Then, Meng Hao's divine sense spread out, filling the entire world. His will superseded the will of the world itself, crushing down, unleashing unmitigated destructive power. He was a windstorm, causing mountains to crumble wherever he passed. The lands disintegrated and the rivers flowed backward. Oceans roared and vast crevices opened up, causing cracking sounds to fill the air as they spread out. It was as if countless dragons were burrowing out through the soil, shaking the entire world. Meng Hao took a step forward, appearing in front of one of the floating cities. He looked at it for a moment, and then his eyes flickered with determination. This was not the time for mercy and kindness. He suddenly recalled the destroyed planets within the mountain and sea realm, and how the viciously grinning outsiders hadn't even spared the mortals. How animalistic, but then again, you really are just animals. His right hand clenched into a fist, and he punched out. Rumbling sounds echoed out, along with blood-curdling screams, as the enormous city was completely destroyed. Meng Hao's divine sense had long since confirmed that within the first heaven, all of the outsiders were lizards. Furthermore, as a species, none of them lacked cultivation bases in the way that mortal humans did. No, all of these lizards from birth had the power of a cultivation base. Because of that, there was no question as to whether or not to wipe them out. He took a step forward, and as he did, he exterminated everything he saw. The land turned gray as the life force was sucked away, and the feeling of death spread out everywhere. Gradually, Meng Hao could detect a howling sound coming from deep within the land, something that originated, not from any outsider, but from the will of the world itself. It could sense his determination to kill everything, which was why it had sent the tribulation lightning against him. Now that he was here in person, it was doing everything it could to try to expel him. The power of expulsion grew stronger, and yet Meng Hao didn't care at all. With his Tao's sovereign fleshly body, divine sense that was 80% as powerful as a paragon's, and the cultivation base of an all-heaven Tao immortal, although he couldn't completely disregard such expulsion power, he could definitely fight back against it. Rumbling could be heard as cities collapsed and statues were destroyed. Countless outsiders let out miserable shrieks as their scales exploded and they were annihilated. Meng Hao was like a god of death, wreaking destruction and slaughter wherever he went. Suddenly, a roar echoed out, which came from none other than what had previously manifested as the face of an old man. It was an enormous ancient lizard, which shot toward him from off in the distance. The power of a 5 essences cultivation base rippled out, and yet before he could even get close, Meng Hao gave a cold harumph, and the lizard lurched to a stop in mid-air, blood spraying out of his mouth. Meng Hao hadn't even waited for it to get close before unleashing a fist strike. A boom rang out as the ancient lizard was completely and utterly destroyed. Cries of misery could be heard ringing out from all corners of the world. There was a constant stream of pleas for mercy, as well as curses. Meng Hao looked at the sky and the land, then waved his hand, sending out divine flame. You suppressed us, you sealed us, and you invaded us. If you want to assign blame, blame heaven and earth for being cruel or blame life for being unfair. Wherever the divine flame passed, destructive power burned everything away. The blood demon roared, and wherever it went the screams of lizards would echo out. Mountains and rivers were demolished, the skies shattered, and numerous buildings and cities fell out of the air. More and more cracks and crevices snaked out across the lands, which shook and began to collapse. From the position of the first heaven itself, what was happening wasn't very clear. However, down in the mountain and sea realm it was obvious. Any cultivator of the mountains and seas could look up at the first heaven, which had supplanted the starry sky, and could hear the booms echoing out and see the dust and ash spreading out. In fact, there were even chunks of rock and rubble which were beginning to fall down. With every boom, the land shook. There were even entire sections which began to crumble, deforming the landscape. The cracks spread out, and there were even some vast slabs as big as asteroids which began to fall down. The first heaven is about to collapse. It's really going to be destroyed. It's Meng Hao, it's him. He attacked the first heaven with the purpose of completely destroying it. Mountain and sea cultivators fight to the death. The cultivators of the mountain and sea realm were going wild, and their eyes gleamed with determination. Their wild shouts, their killing intent, and their will to fight caused the heavens to grow dim. The outsiders were trembling in shock as they saw their home shattering into pieces. All of a sudden, their will to fight was replaced with utter dread and terror. One side was empowered, the other side was demoralized. The balance of battle was instantly overturned. The sounds of fierce fighting rang out as the cultivators of the 9 mountains and seas began to fight back with a vengeance. The imperial lord howled, the paragon raged, the Tao sovereign was in a frenzy, and yet there was nothing they could do to stop what was happening. The heavens were collapsing. The earth was shattering. The spirits of the cultivators of the mountain and sea realm were rising. The inextinguishable spark of faith that burned within their hearts had been kindled by Meng Hao, and now it was beginning to burn brightly. In the 8th mountain and sea, Patriarch Reliance was floating above a battlefield filled with mountains of outsider corpses. He was looking up into the starry sky, at the crumbling land mass that was the first heaven. After a moment of silence, he began to laugh loudly. That's my disciple, the ninth-generation demon sealer, Meng Hao, incredible. I ran from you for years, unwilling to be restricted, unwilling to become someone's mount. But now, you little bastard, what you've done and what you've said have convinced me. Henceforth, I am willing to be Meng Hao's mount. I, the Patriarch, am completely willing and will never have any regrets. Patriarch Reliance threw his head back and howled, then shot up into the starry sky. Now that he had made his decision to be Meng Hao's mount, he would fulfill the ancient agreement. He would be the Tao protector of the ninth-generation demon sealer without the slightest hesitation. Therefore, he flew up into the air to go meet Meng Hao. Guiding Trirane was there on Patriarch Reliance's head, giggling with happiness. She had been waiting for this day for a very, very long time. At the same time, a middle-aged man could be seen standing atop Mount Daqing, there on Patriarch Reliance's back, also looking up into the starry sky. He was suppressing the fierceness of his own gaze, but if he weren't, it would be completely shocking. He did not emanate the fluctuations of the Tao realm, nor the ancient realm. He was not an immortal, nor some type of spirit. In fact, he appeared to be mortal without any cultivation-based fluctuations at all. And yet he seemed incredibly dangerous. Astonishingly, that middle-aged man was none other than Donghu. I, Donghu, have been taking care of this treasure for my entire life. It was not destined to be mine, which means that I have been preparing it for someone else. I realized that many years ago, but by then I had already become the spirit of the treasure. But what does that really matter? Back in the very beginning, there were 4 boys who had been taken by Su Qing to the Reliance sect: Meng Hao, Wang Yaoke, Fatty, and Donghu. After all of them were separated, Su Qing entered the cycle of reincarnation. Wang Yaokai lost his eyes to gain ultimate enlightenment. Fatty gained numerous wives and concubines, and Meng Hao made a meteoric rise. As of this moment, Donghu was standing on Mount Daqing, there on Patriarch Reliance's back as he charged up into the starry sky. Chapter 1341, The Tao Sovereign Escapes. Meng Hao was battering the land mass that was the first heaven. Massive cracks and fissures were spreading out, and it was hard to tell how much longer the first heaven would be able to hold together. Meanwhile, down in the 8th mountain and sea, rumbling sounds echoed out from the region of the 33 hells. Then the starry sky seemed to shatter as a huge rift opened up. A bedraggled figure trudged out, a figure who radiated both madness and venomous hatred. He immediately coughed up a massive mouthful of blood, after which flames of insanity ignited within his eyes. Then he threw his head back and let out a piercing howl. Meng Hao, I hereby swear to wipe out your entire clan. It was none other than the golden-armored outsider Long Lindsay, who Meng Hao had lured into the 33 hells, one of the outsiders, 2 Tao sovereigns. Currently, not a scrap of golden armor could be seen on him. He was in very sore straits and was clearly fatigued. However, his energy level was no less than before, and in fact, he was slightly stronger. It was impossible to tell what torments he had endured within the 33 hells, nor how he had managed to escape. However, the price he had paid was clearly unimaginable. Were that not the case, he wouldn't be so consumed with resentment. As soon as he appeared, his divine sense spread out, whereupon a tremor ran through him. He heard the shouts and cries coming from the cultivators of the 8th mountain and sea, as well as his fellow outsiders, and looked up into the sky. Then he saw his home, the land mass that was the first heaven, beginning to crumble. What filled him with more fury than ever was that he could clearly sense the aura of Meng Hao, whom he hated with a passion, and couldn't wait to tear apart with his teeth. Meng Hao, he growled, throwing his head back, letting out a mind-bogglingly powerful roar that filled the entire 8th mountain and sea. All cultivators and outsiders felt their minds trembling as Long Lindsay transformed into a beam of bright light that shot up into the air. Paragon Igu was still in the middle of battling Paragon Sea Dream. He hadn't been very anxious earlier, but was now considering paying any price, no matter how severe, to break away from the fight. However, as soon as he sensed Long Lindsay's aura, his eyes began to shine with a strange light. The imperial lord who was fighting Kesidigarbha had the same reaction. The Tao sovereign incarnations breathed sighs of relief. Then all 3 of these outsiders let loose powerful streams of divine will, which sent ripples out into the void. Kill Meng Hao, stop him. Regardless of the price, he must be cut down. The shocking level of their divine will spread throughout the entire mountain and sea realm, causing all cultivators to sense it. Those cultivators' faces instantly flickered, and anxiety sprang up in their hearts. Meng Hao had become the symbol of their spirit, the spark that fueled the flames in their eyes. If the first heaven truly fell, then that spark would grow into an inferno which could inundate heaven and earth. But if the first heaven didn't fall, and if Meng Hao died, then those flames would not do a lick of damage to anyone except themselves. Countless numbers of cultivators watched anxiously as everything shook. As for Long Lindsay, he knew exactly what his mission was. The safety of his homeland and his enmity toward Meng Hao became one, filling him with an explosive madness that caused him to disregard even his own safety. Meng Hao? Long Lindsay let out a mighty roar as he shot with incredible speed toward the first heaven. As he neared, the land mass up above continued to break apart. There were even some places along the borders that were falling. Scattered fragments of stone were falling down through the starry sky, which were then set aflame by the friction of entering the region of the mountain and sea realm. Soon, the starry sky was like a sea of flames. Everyone watching was filled with complete and utter shock. Long Lindsay even began to burn his own life force, causing flames to burst out around him as he shot toward the first heaven. In the same moment that he was about to set foot into the first heaven, Meng Hao was hovering there in midair, looking at the mass of flames around him. Miserable shrieks rang out in his ears as the lands cracked and crumbled. Cities fell in ruin, and numerous buildings collapsed. Mountains became plains, and plains became rifts and valleys. He could sense the power of expulsion coming from the world, as well as the bitterness of the world's will as it howled in grief. Inwardly, Meng Hao sighed, then suddenly looked off into the distance. A moment later, his eyes came to rest on Long Lindsay, who had just burst into the first heaven like a lightning bolt. This was his home, where he had grown up and practiced cultivation. He had many wonderful memories of this place, and everywhere he looked he could see places where he had spent time. But now looking around caused him to tremble, and his vision to turn red as if with blood. He wanted to say something, to shout out, but no sound would come. He began to pant, and the feeling of fury and madness within him was completely overwhelming. "Why you maniac? I can't believe you're willing to destroy my people, my tribe, all the cities, the entire world. We might be at war, but how could you go so far?" Long Lindsay's maddened eyes were completely bloodshot and were even shedding tears of blood. His heart felt as if it were being stabbed. In all directions he only saw destroyed cities and countless numbers of his people dead or dying. He smelled the blood of his fellow tribesmen and could see piles of corpses and ruins. "Meng Hao," he roared. Filled with hatred and madness, he transformed into a beam of light that shot toward Meng Hao, causing everything to shake. "So you do understand that there are limits to the wars of cultivators. Mortals should be left alone." Meng Hao looked scornfully at Long Lindsay. Voice cool, he said, "I'm not sure about all of the other cultivators in the mountains and seas," he continued, "but I live by the motto, an eye for an eye, blood for blood. Today, the extermination of the first heaven is only the beginning." Meng Hao's voice was as cold as ice as it echoed out. At the same time, he clenched his right hand into a fist and then punched out toward Long Lindsay. He was 5,000 kilometers away, but he still unleashed the life extermination fist. A will of extermination exploded out, sucking in all of the life force in the area, the life of the first heaven. That fist strike shook lands, rocked mountains, and caused colors to flash in the air as it rumbled forth. Long Lindsay's eyes widened. Although he was completely enraged, he was still in command of his senses. As soon as Meng Hao attacked, his heart began to thump. Even though the power of the fist strike came purely from Meng Hao's fleshly body, it still filled him with a sensation of intense danger. Without any hesitation, he performed a double-handed incantation gesture and then pointed toward Meng Hao. Instantly, essence power exploded out, becoming a six-colored vortex that slammed into Meng Hao's fist strike. Rumble! Heaven and earth were trembling, as was Long Lindsay as he staggered backward, blood spraying out of his mouth. Meng Hao also fell back, and although every step he took was upon the air itself, the ground below quaked in response, and after a few steps it exploded. The ground collapsed for 3,000 meters in all directions as a huge hole appeared in the earth. Rocks and rubble fell down toward the mountain, and sea realm as a crater was opened up that pierced through the entire first heaven. In fact, if you looked down into that breach, you would be able to see the mountain and sea realm down below. That was how Meng Hao fought, borrowing the force of an attack against him to unleash his own bombardment. Long Lindsay roared, and his hands flashed in a double-handed incantation gesture, causing 6 essences to erupt out. They instantly transformed into 6 ferocious lizards, which radiated fearsome wills of extermination as they charged Meng Hao. Meng Hao's eyes flickered, and he laughed coldly. His right hand flashed with an incantation gesture, and then he waved it out, summoning the Paragon Bridge. When the Paragon Bridge descended onto the 6 essence lizards, a massive rumbling boom echoed out as everything was destroyed. Long Lindsay looked at the shattered lands that were his home and screamed. Then, laughing bitterly, he began to burn his life force to explosively increase the power of his cultivation base. In the blink of an eye, he pierced through the air to appear in front of Meng Hao. His hands flashed in a double-handed incantation gesture, and flames leapt out to form a gigantic mouth which lunged toward Meng Hao. Meng Hao had no time to dodge. He simply watched as the black mouth of flames bit down onto him. Black flames raged as everything was ripped open, the sky, the land, and the air. But then, rumbling sounds could be heard as the black flames collapsed, and Meng Hao walked out, holding the battle weapon. He didn't pause for even a moment before charging Long Lindsay. The battle weapon was incredibly powerful, but was also quite draining. Although Meng Hao was careful with how he drew upon his cultivation base, when the time came to attack, he never hesitated. And now, the battle weapon was slashing down toward Long Lindsay. In that instant, however, a tremor ran through Long Lindsay, and he suddenly threw his head back and howled. Blood sprayed out of his mouth as his body unexpectedly split apart like a cicada shedding its carapace. Shockingly, only one of those bodies was hit by the battle weapon. The other body fell back in full retreat, black light flickering around him. Although his aura had diminished, he was completely uninjured. "How many times can you attack like that?" Long Lindsay roared, a windstorm kicking up around him. Meng Hao frowned, performed an incantation gesture with his left hand, and then pointed toward Long Lindsay. It was the 8th demon sealing hex, and yet, as soon as the hexing magic was unleashed, Long Lindsay threw his head back and roared. "Mother of lizards, will of the first heaven, safeguard me." As Long Lindsay roared, a shocking will arose from within the crumbling first heaven. It instantly descended upon Long Lindsay, fighting back against the hexing magic, completely negating it in shocking fashion. Meng Hao's eyes narrowed, but he didn't hesitate. He put the battle weapon away and then clenched his fist to unleash the bedevilment fist. Chapter 1342, Earth Shatters. Long Lindsay was sent tumbling backward with a boom. Blood sprayed out of his mouth, but a vicious expression could be seen on his face as he began to perform an incantation gesture. However, even as he did so, Meng Hao snorted coldly and transformed into an azure rock. As the rock closed in, talons ripped through the air toward Long Lindsay. Even as those talons closed in, rumbling sounds echoed out from Long Lindsay as he abandoned his humanoid shape and transformed into a black lizard. Roaring, he swept his tail through the air, shattering it as it bashed into the rock. The azure rock shattered and blood oozed out of the corners of Meng Hao's mouth. However, he didn't slow down. Instead, his right hand clenched into a fist and he punched Long Lindsay directly in the chest. This was none other than the God-slaying fist. It converged his will with the will of heaven, turning into a fist strike that could exterminate everything. Massive booms rang out as the fist absorbed half of the life force of the entire first heaven, unleashing both a spirit of bedevilment and a will of God-slaying. Long Lindsay screamed miserably as he was sent tumbling backward. His flesh and blood were mangled, his scales shattered. He slammed into the ground, which quaked as a huge crater opened up. As that crater crumbled open, Meng Hao once again began to grow in size until he was 3,000 meters tall. Then he took a step forward, leaping into the crater and slamming another fist toward Long Lindsay. However, as the fist was unleashed, Meng Hao frowned. Long Lindsay's body was somewhat blurry, and he even let out a cold snort. "Not real," Meng Hao murmured, his expression calm. However, his right hand didn't slow down, but instead sped up as it rocketed toward the illusory figure. The full power of his fleshly body and his cultivation base backed the fist's strike as it passed through the illusion and slammed into the earth behind it. The resulting boom shook the entire landmass. Several massive craters formed that penetrated all the way through to the other side of the landmass, sending massive amounts of rubble tumbling down toward the mountain and sea realm. As for Meng Hao himself, he followed the collapse of the crater down, evading the vicious tail strike which swept out from Long Lindsay. As the tail screamed past his head, Long Lindsay roared viciously, then changed tactics, reaching out with his hands to grab Meng Hao. "You don't need to come after me," Meng Hao said coolly. The lightning cauldron suddenly appeared above his head. Lighting danced, and he turned in the direction of Long Lindsay, instantly switching places with him via form displacement transposition. The moment they switched locations, Meng Hao unleashed his divine sense, which was 80% as powerful as a paragon's. A boom could be heard as it crushed onto Long Lindsay, shoving him downward. Divine sense that powerful should have been enough to seriously injure him, and yet an enormous statue suddenly appeared behind him, which surrounded Long Lindsay and also resisted the divine sense. As it fought back, it pushed aggressively toward Meng Hao. Just when Meng Hao was about to counterattack, a sacrificial power suddenly rose up from within the fourth mountain and sea. That sacrificial power caused Long Lindsay to grow rapidly, and also increased the level of his cultivation base. He then threw his head back and howled as he shot toward Meng Hao at top speed. Meng Hao frowned. He could tell that the outsider imperial lord who was fighting with Xianxia in the fourth mountain and sea could not extricate himself from the fight. Instead, he had unleashed this secret magic, taking some of his own cultivation base and imparting it upon Long Lindsay. Rumbling echoed out as flames erupted around the incoming Long Lindsay. Then he performed an incantation gesture, and the huge statue's eyes opened. It glared at Meng Hao with a look like death itself, completely locking down the area surrounding him. Die, howled Long Lindsay, barreling forward to slam his head into Meng Hao. Meng Hao's right hand shot up, and the meat jelly appeared. Knowing exactly what Meng Hao wanted, it simply sighed and transformed into a wide rubbery membrane. A mighty thwacking sound echoed out as Long Lindsay slammed into the meat jelly and was then propelled backward. The force of his blow dispersed. Trembling, Long Lindsay let out a roar, and yet it couldn't drown out the cry of pain that rang out from the meat jelly's mouth. OWWW, that hurt like hell. Lord Third gives up. I give up. The meat jelly rapidly shrank back down, transforming into a beam of light that shot back into Meng Hao's bag of holding. As for Long Lindsay, the backlash sent stabs of pain throughout his body, setting his chi and blood aboil and temporarily freezing up his cultivation base. Meng Hao's eyes flickered. Even as Long Lindsay fell back, he extended his right hand and waved his finger to unleash the eighth demon sealing hex. Long Lindsay lurched to a stop. They were no longer in the first heaven now, but rather underneath it. Therefore, Long Lindsay could no longer benefit from the blessing of the will of the first heaven, and thus the demon sealing hex immediately succeeded. Almost as soon as Long Lindsay lurched to a stop, the battle weapon appeared in Meng Hao's hand, which he slashed out. Let's see how you escape this time, he said. Killing intent flickered in Meng Hao's eyes. This slashing blade was moving too fast for Long Lindsay to be able to defend against. No escape magic could be used, and he was also locked in place by Meng Hao's hexing magic. However, it was at this point that, in another part of the starry sky, the outsider paragon who was fighting Sea Dream suddenly let out a powerful roar, causing a blood-colored light to shine from its body. Instantly, a similar blood-colored light began to shine from Long Lindsay. Apparently, some sort of strange connection had sprung up between the two of them. Blood symbiosis, Sea Dream said coldly. Igu, you really dare to unleash this magic while fighting me. She immediately attacked the paragon. However, because of the blood-colored light, Meng Hao's attack was already doomed to fail. Long Lindsay vanished, reappearing off in the distance a moment later. Meanwhile, Meng Hao's battle weapon slashed a massive rift into the void. Off in the distance, Long Lindsay glared at Meng Hao, his lips twisting into a smile. However, instead of heading toward Meng Hao again, he turned and shot toward the mountain and sea realm. Meng Hao simply watched him go, eyes cold. Meng Hao, since you dare to exterminate the first heaven, I'll just start exterminating cultivators of the mountain and sea realm. Let's see whether or not you choose to save them. Long Lindsay was already coughing up blood and in a completely bedraggled state. Roaring, he shot toward the mountain and sea realm, hoping to force Meng Hao to stop attacking the first heaven. You want to wipe out the first heaven? I'll slaughter your mountain and sea cultivators. Let's see which of us is the most ruthless and who gives in first. The maddened Long Lindsay rapidly picked up speed. Do you care more about this dying land mass than the living cultivators of the mountains and seas? What's your choice, Meng Hao? Meng Hao's pupils constricted. The effective power of his cultivation base was already past the 5 essences level and was fully in the 6 essences level. However, Long Lindsay was at the same level. Although there was some difference between them, that difference wasn't vast. Furthermore, Meng Hao's most powerful asset, his divine sense, was something his opponent was already equipped to defend himself against. Most relevant was that he had received blessings from an imperial lord and a paragon. Because of all those terrifying enhancements, he had numerous ways to avoid death. Were that not the case, he would already be dead, cut down by Meng Hao's battle weapon. An unsightly expression appeared on Meng Hao's face. Suddenly, he transmitted a message. Chuman Tai, can you turn this outsider paragon ego into a puppet? Chuman Tai's ancient voice immediately echoed back in response. To guarantee success, it must be done when the paragon is personally attacking you. I only have one chance to pull it off, and in this situation the likelihood of success is less than 30%. In all of Meng Hao's calculations, he had never anticipated that Long Lindsay would escape from the battle at such a critical moment. Now that he thought about it, it most likely had something to do with the outsider paragon. Only that paragon would be able to save Long Lindsay, and then use him to pin Meng Hao down. Meng Hao had no choice. Rationally speaking, he should just continue to attack the first heaven. However, his heart wouldn't let him do that. Sighing softly, he was about to make his choice when his eyes suddenly widened. Looking down toward the mountain and sea realm, he saw a bright beam of light shooting with incredible speed, directly toward Long Lindsay. Patriarch Reliance, Meng Hao thought, completely shaken. It was none other than Patriarch Reliance, howling as he flew along at top speed. Hey, you wimpy little lizard, Patriarch Reliance is here to put you in your place. Patriarch Reliance roared, suddenly growing even more gargantuan in size as he barreled toward the Long Lindsay. At the same time, a tremor ran through Patriarch Reliance, and rumbling sounds could be heard as innumerable magical symbols appeared all over him. When Patriarch Reliance wasn't attacking Meng Hao, those magical symbols could actually bolster the power of his cultivation base. Furthermore, the fluctuations of sealing marks being released suddenly emanated out. Patriarch Reliance's biggest secret was something that no one except for Meng Hao knew about. He had been alive since the days of the ancient demon immortal sect. When he and Meng Hao had clashed in the past, the cultivation base power he had unleashed was already in the Dao realm. There was even a brief moment once where he had emitted the fluctuations of a Dao Lord. Patriarch Reliance was one tough cookie, and the fact that he was now on a collision course with him filled Long Lindsay with fear. Now, thanks to the interference of Patriarch Reliance, he was unable to engage in any form of slaughter in the mountain and sea realm. Meng Hao laughed loudly. Now, it was without any hesitation that he shot back toward the land mass that was the first heaven. To the grief of the will of the first heaven, rumbling could be heard as more cities fell, and more statues were destroyed. Mountains and rivers vanished, and the entire land mass began to show signs that it was going to fall completely. Chunks of rubble began to drop down as fissures spread out across the entire land mass. Rumbling sounds could be heard as huge sections of land began to tumble down. All of the cultivators of the mountain and sea realm watched as the land mass, that was the first heaven, began to shatter into pieces. Expand. Spirits were stirred. As of this moment, all cultivators of the mountain and sea realm felt their spirits rising in unprecedented fashion. Mountain and sea cultivators fight to the death. In all of the 9 mountains and seas, the cultivators were whipped into an excited frenzy. They immediately launched vicious counterattacks against the outsiders. At the same time, their hearts were filled with anticipation. Anticipation, at the thought of the heaven which loomed over them falling to pieces. They were waiting. Each and every one of the mountain and sea cultivators was waiting. They were waiting for heaven to collapse. Afterward, that heaven would never again block the gazes of the cultivators of the mountain and sea realm as they looked up into the sky. Layer by layer, the ceiling of the 33 heavens would be destroyed, and the mountain and sea cultivators would be able to look up into the true starry sky and see the true vast expanse. It would be just like in the days of the Paragon Immortal Realm, when they were valiant and indomitable in spirit. The outsiders were in a daze, trembling as they looked up at the shattering land mass that was the first heaven. For the first time, they truly felt fear and dread regarding the Paragon Immortal Realm which had existed deep in their blood and was now gradually seeping out. Countless outsiders were shaking in fear, and although they were still fighting, still struggling against the mountain and sea cultivators, that was only because they still held hope that the land mass above would not collapse. The imperial lord roared and the paragon raged. Wild colors flashed in heaven and earth, and massive rumbling sounds could be heard. The first heaven was shaking violently, and more pieces were beginning to crumble away. The will of the world that existed in the first heaven let out a scream of boundless grief, as if it were dying. Shockingly, corpses were now falling down through the cracks that spread throughout the first heaven. There were also the crumbled ruins of buildings, and even large swaths of entire cities. The whole world was completely shaken. No, despondent howls rang out from several different locations among the mountains and seas, where the incarnations of the outsider Tao sovereign were. Those various incarnations had been fighting the mountain and sea lords, but now they were trembling and losing the will to fight. Their eyes were bright red, and in their madness, tears of blood were seeping down. That was because they had just caught sight of a city falling down out of the sky. Only about half of it was left intact, and that city was actually the personal fiefdom of the outsider Tao sovereign in the first heaven. It also was the home of many of his relatives. But now the city was collapsing, and thus one could imagine the fates of all of those relatives. Meng Hao howled the incarnations of the outsider Tao sovereign, which then went all out, paying any price, even burning their life forces to try to break out from being pinned down by the mountain and sea lords. Of course, the mountain and sea lords weren't in the same position as the outsider Tao sovereign, and weren't willing to burn their life forces. In the brief moment of hesitation in which they tried to decide what to do, the Tao sovereign's incarnations burst free. Beams of burning light shot through the air to converge together into a unified figure, which was the complete Tao sovereign. Although his incarnations had been severely injured, and two had been cut down by Meng Hao, burning his life force quickly returned him to his peak. Throwing his head back and howling, he shot toward the first heaven, brimming with hatred and madness. As of this moment, all outsiders could see what was happening, and were shaking in anticipation of their Tao sovereign preventing their home from being destroyed. Tears of blood streaked down the outsider Tao sovereign's face as he shot through the air toward the first heaven. However, in almost the exact same instant that he took to flight, massive, jaw-dropping rumbling sounds echoed out from the first heaven, shaking the entire mountain and sea realm. The noise was so loud that cultivators and outsiders alike felt as if their eardrums would burst at any moment. All of them stopped fighting and looked up toward the first heaven. What they saw was a massive crack splitting the entire landmass, as a chunk that comprised nearly 10% of the entire structure suddenly began to split off, accompanied by grating sounds as loud as thunder. A massive chunk of the overall landmass, a piece large as the starry sky of any of the mountains and seas, slowly began to sag down. As that chunk slowly tilted to the side, all buildings and structures atop the land mass crumbled. However, it was also possible to see areas where the chunk was still connected to the main land mass. It was in that moment that Meng Hao appeared. He raised his right hand and unleashed a fist strike. To the shock of everyone, that blast cut all connections with the main land mass. A full 10% of the entire land mass began to fall down toward the mountain and sea realm. It was incredibly enormous, so big that it seemed capable of crushing anything beneath it. However, it was then that the will of the mountains and seas swept out, shredding the lifeless chunk into countless clouds of rubble, which exploded out into the starry sky like blooming flowers and then slowly floated downward. The mountain and sea realm went completely silent. The outsiders stared with wide eyes. The outsider Tao sovereign was trembling, and then let out a miserable howl filled with despair, hatred, and even regret. Whether he regretted splitting himself into multiple incarnations, or regretted marching out to battle and the war itself, only he could know. Then rumbling sounds echoed out as a second chunk of the land mass began to split off. Then a third, a fourth, and a fifth. Seas of flame raged in the starry sky, illuminating the entire mountain and sea realm. By now, the land mass was completely riddled with massive cracks. One chunk after another began to break off and fall down toward the mountain and sea realm. A long moment passed, and then the loudest boom of them all echoed out, a boom which rocked the whole mountain and sea realm and the entire first heaven. Boom! It was like a sudden clap of thunder that roared out into the starry sky and even caused the mountain and sea realm to vibrate. Then, gasps began to rise up into the air. The first heaven was completely collapsing. All cultivators of the mountain and sea realm could see that it was completely and utterly broken into countless pieces. Rubble fell down, as if the first heaven were a mirror which had been shattered. Not a single piece of land was qualified to remain floating up above in the starry sky. All of the shattered, crushed, and broken remnants fell down out of the sky. Heaven collapsed. That collapse was only a collapse of the first heaven, but as of this moment, it was a huge blow to all outsiders within the mountain and sea realm. They were trembling violently, and none of them could even speak. Their eyes were filled with blankness and despair. Their home was gone. Their home, which had flourished for tens upon tens of thousands of years, was now gone. Their fellow tribe members were gone. In the past, countless relatives had lived quiet lives up in the first heaven, but now they were gone. The first heaven was destroyed, shattered into pieces. Cities, rubble, and corpses fell down like rain. Everything was no more. Despair washed through the outsiders, and they no longer had any will to fight. They were trembling and terrified. In sharp contrast, the cultivators of the mountain and sea realm were enlivened and completely ready to do battle. Chapter 1343, Heaven Collapses. Note from Deathblade. This is another short chapter. Jen said that he felt this was the proper place to end it, and it was also one of his 4 updates in a day times when he was campaigning for monthly vote tickets. /expand. Meng Hao had truly done something that shook heaven and earth, a mighty act. He could not illuminate every inch of the starry sky of the mountain and sea realm, but he could cause light to shine within the eyes of all cultivators there, to gleam within their hearts and their divine will. That light was the spirit of the mountain and sea realm, the rise to prominence of an entire people. He destroyed the first heaven to crush the hearts of the outsiders, and to give hope to the mountain and sea cultivators, to stir their hearts. We can do it. We can still secure victory. Rumbling echoed down from above, and at the same time, the cultivators of the mountain and sea realm roared. Their impassioned cries swept out like tempests. Not even the sounds of the first heaven's destruction could drown them out. The first heaven is collapsing. The first heaven is no more. He did it, Meng Hao actually did it. People were shouting and crying, and their tears glistened under the flickering light of the flames overhead. The light their eyes shone with was that of hope, of inspiration, and of determination. Within the 7th mountain and sea, on planet Tiger Cage, the cultivators were all trembling with excitement. Their hearts had been dead, but now that the first heaven was collapsing, it was as if they had been resurrected. In the 9 mountains and seas, the cultivators on all of the battlefields had been repressed for far too long. Now that the first heaven had collapsed, they erupted out, exploded, and their rising spirits filled the entire mountain and sea realm. Meng Hao, Meng Hao. It was hard to say who said it first, but soon everyone was chanting his name. All of the voices in the mountain and sea realm joined together into a thunderous cry. The sound of their conjoined voices rose up through the starry sky, until even Meng Hao could hear them. Meng Hao, Meng Hao. Meng Hao, Meng Hao. The mountain and sea realm was astir in a way it had never been before. The cultivators were bursting with excitement, and as for the outsiders, they were trembling in despair and utter terror. Although they didn't completely understand, they could sense that the cultivators of the mountain and sea realm were different than they had been before. They were more valiant, more unyielding, and more terrifying. It was as if a unified people was finally rising up. It was as if the mountain and sea realm had been a sleeping giant that anyone could humiliate freely, but now that giant had opened its eyes. It was awake. That awakening caused heaven and earth to flash with colors. That awakening caused the starry sky to be completely shaken. The crumbling first heaven up above was like a sacrificial offering which was now awakening the mountain and sea realm. In the 9th mountain and sea, everyone in the Fang clan was cheering. Fang Ziyufeng couldn't be more excited as he watched Meng Hao, his heart bursting with intense pride. He wanted to shout out to all cultivators of the mountain and sea realm, Meng Hao is my son. All of the chosen who Meng Hao had dealt with in the past, be it Fan Donger or Jai Yin, couldn't help but be swept up in the excitement. Although they had some mixed emotions, they weren't thinking about the things that had happened in the past. In their eyes they saw a blazing sun, lifting the spirits of the people, Meng Hao. In fact, there were even some cultivators who looked over at those chosen, and suddenly realized that owing Meng Hao money might actually be something that one could be proud of. If Meng Hao asked, there would be hosts of people who would elatedly write promissory notes for him. To be connected to him by karma could be considered good fortune. Su Qing was smiling, Fang Yu was smiling, and Meng Li was smiling. A smile could even be seen on the face of Li Linger. As of this moment, all cultivators of the mountain and sea realm felt something different inside of them that hadn't been there before. On planet South Heaven, Shui Dongliu watched the mountain and sea realm rise up, watched hope appear, and he threw his head back and laughed. With this spirit then, even if the mountains and seas are defeated, then as long as a single cultivator remains alive, then the spark will burn, and the bloodline of the mountains and seas will be passed down for all eternity. Shui Dongliu laughed heartily, a laughter of pure happiness. He knew that as of this day, victory and defeat were not important. Up in the starry sky, Meng Hao hovered there, looking down at the entirety of the mountain and sea realm. At the same time, the cultivators down below were looking up through the shattered remnants of the first heaven at Meng Hao. Meng Hao felt as if he should say something, so he thought for a moment, then spoke. "I am a mountain and sea cultivator." He bolstered his words with his cultivation base and divine sense, causing them to echo out, starting with the fourth mountain and sea, then spreading to the third, second, first as well as the fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, and ninth. Gradually, everyone in the mountain and sea realm was shouting the exact same thing. "I am a mountain and sea cultivator. I am a mountain and sea cultivator. I am a mountain and sea cultivator." The sound rolled out as each and every cultivator shouted from the bottoms of their heart, shouted words that contained their lives, their wills, and their pride. Even more shocking was what happened next. There on planet South Heaven, Shui Dongliu threw his head back and lifted both hands up into the air. In response, the will of the mountain and sea realm began to boil and rumble explosively. Massive amounts of the energy of heaven and earth, which had been stored up for years, now spread out through the entire mountain and sea realm, boring into the bodies of all cultivators. One by one, people began to roar as they experienced cultivation-based breakthroughs. They had been suppressed for far too long, but now, the seal of the 33 heavens was weakening. Now that the mountain and sea realm had been stimulated, the cultivators began to soar. Henceforth, the 33 heavens were now 32 heavens, and their seal had lost one of its layers. As the rumbling sounds echoed out into the ears of the outsiders, they shook and began to edge backward. They no longer had any will or faith to fight whatsoever. Even the outsider Tao sovereign Long Lindsay, who was fighting Patriarch Reliance, was shaking. Perhaps we were mistaken. A mountain and sea realm like this, the continuation of the Paragon immortal realm itself, is something that we cannot subjugate, that we cannot destroy. The outsider Imperial Lord fighting with Kesidigarbha also began to shake. His cultivation base put him on the cusp of being a paragon, and therefore he could see even more of what was happening. He could see the mountain and sea realm awakening, and he could see its aura slowly rising up from deep within. Outsider Paragon Igu, who was fighting Paragon Sea Dream, felt intense bitterness in his heart. As a paragon, he could see the entirety of the mountain and sea realm and understood everything that was happening. He could also sense that terrifying aura rising up, the pride which had been passed down all the way from the Paragon immortal realm. The immortals from the era of the Paragon immortal realm had been valiant, proud without being arrogant. They had been powerful but not cruel, and had thus subjugated numerous lower realms, sweeping across all heaven and earth, dominating the starry skies. It had been a very, very long time since Paragon Igu saw an aura like this, and yet, here it was on this day. Yet again, he felt that aura taking root. This kid might not love fighting, he thought, and he might not understand troop movements and formations, nor does he excel in the art of war or of military campaigns. However, he has mastered the quintessence of war. Ordinary people think that war is about subjugation. Some more intelligent people realize that it is about death and destruction. However, the truly wise know that war is about destroying the spirit of your enemy. Any given world and any given people have a spirit that leads to the most terrifying kind of willpower. Back in the days of the Paragon immortal realm, that spirit was suppressed, and that willpower altered, forced to hole up here. It was sealed up, not just by the 33 heavens, but by the people themselves. But now everything has changed. That kid must die. The outsider Paragon's eyes flickered with cold light. It was at about this time that bitter laughter could be heard not too far away from Meng Hao. It was the outsider Tao sovereign, who had now converged his incarnations back together, who had burned his life force to try to prevent the first heaven from collapsing. However, he had acted too late. Now, his mind was completely shaking. Rumbling sounds echoed out as he shot murderously toward Meng Hao, raving in madness. "You destroyed my home, and you destroyed my people," he shrieked as he closed in at top speed. "You wiped out everything that was ours, Meng Hao." "You wiped yourselves out," Meng Hao said calmly. He was just about to launch an attack when all of a sudden he turned to look at the collapsing first heaven. He could sense the aura of essence. World essence, he thought. Eyes glittering, heart surging with elation, he thought back to the world essence of the windswept realm. The enormous land mass that was the first heaven also had essence, although it vastly exceeded the essence from the windswept realm. After all, this had been one of the few surviving, unbroken remnants of the 3,000 lower realms. Therefore, it was only natural that this place had world essence. 1. World essence was a fairly important part of the windswept realm arc and was mentioned many times. The most relevant chapters were 1147-1149. World essence was a supreme Tao, a complete Tao based on an entire world. As such, different worlds had different types of world essence. Years before, Meng Hao had experienced numerous deadly situations, all to acquire the world essence of the windswept realm. After acquiring it, he had been able to unlock his All-Heaven Tao immortal bloodline, and had even been able to plant the All-Heaven Tao seed within the blood of the entire Fang clan. That world essence had affected Meng Hao in a profound way. In fact, later on, the only reason why he eventually rose to the heights he had, to be able to slaughter Tao lords and Tao sovereigns, was because of his All-Heaven bloodline. And that was because of the windswept realm's world essence, the traitorous sutra of the rebel Tao. As of this moment, Meng Hao was completely shaken. He could sense the All-Heaven Tao immortal blood inside him boiling, as if it were consumed by incredible thirst. He suddenly had the intense premonition that if he could get that world essence, then he might have a chance to further awaken his All-Heaven Tao immortal blood. He could even sense that the world essence of the first heaven was something very different than the windswept realm's traitorous sutra of the rebel Tao. If he could gain enlightenment of it, the results would be extraordinary. It could help cultivators gain enlightenment of great Tao relics of heaven and earth. The 33 heavens had tolerated the windswept realm only because of its world essence which they coveted. Right now, as the land mass that was the first heaven collapsed, it was possible to tell that this world essence was far more powerful than the windswept realm's. Furthermore, it was now seeping out through the shattered cracks that riddled the first heaven. Meng Hao didn't hesitate for a moment. He flickered into motion, avoiding the outsider Tao sovereign to suddenly appear in the location of the world essence. When that happened, an intense essence aura rumbled out toward Meng Hao. His mind suddenly grew 100 times clearer, and he became 100 times more agile. The feeling of a great Tao, of a powerful essence, was even more explosive than before. Most importantly, his powers of deduction were now vastly beyond what they had been. Even his bloodline experienced strange transformation, signs of absorption and change. Chapter 1344, Another Encounter with World Essence.